The night was thick with fog, the kind that clings to the cobblestones and seeps into every alleyway of a city that never truly sleeps, even in the heart of medieval Europe. Candlelight flickered behind shuttered windows, casting shadows that danced like specters across the stone walls. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled the hour, its hollow sound swallowed by the darkness. But in a small, secluded courtyard, away from the watchful eyes of the common folk, whispers carried more weight than the chimes of the cathedral. Powerful men and women moved silently, their cloaks brushing against the cold ground, faces half hidden beneath hoods. They spoke not of feasts or festivals, but of strategy, influence, and legacy, subjects far removed from the prayers they offered in the morning or the public duties they performed by day. These were the keepers of secrets, the invisible hands shaping kingdoms, the bloodlines that controlled the knights themselves. For centuries, the stories told to children spoke only of valor and faith. Tales of knights in shining armor, of holy wars fought in the name of God, of courage tested on distant shores. But the truth, the story whispered behind locked doors, was far more complex and unsettling. The knights, their banners, their swords, their legendary loyalty, were not merely men of faith. They were instruments, sometimes unwilling, sometimes complicit, of families whose names rarely appeared in the chronicles of history. Families who understood that power was not wielded openly, but in shadows, in secret marriages, in debts owed and favors called in long after the handshakes were made. They knew that faith could be a weapon, and that devotion could be molded to serve ambition. One of the most chilling aspects of these hidden bloodlines was their patience. While kings and popes acted in haste, swayed by the passions of the moment, these families planned in decades and generations. They orchestrated alliances before a child could walk, ceded influence in foreign courts while they mastered their own domains, and ensured that when knights marched to war, the outcome often aligned with their own interests. The knights were celebrated for bravery on the battlefield, yet few realized that many of their victories or their failures were carefully guided from a distance, by men and women whose faces were never painted on a tapestry or carved into stone. These families understood human nature as keenly as they understood war. They could read a man's ambition, predict his loyalties, and subtly steer him toward decisions that served a greater, unseen plan. A knight might swear to defend the weak, yet the orders he followed could enrich one family at the expense of another, or ensure a particular line of inheritance remained unbroken. The contrast between sacred vows and worldly strategy was stark, yet it remained invisible to the masses. And therein lay the power. The more secret the influence, the more complete its control. The courtyard was quiet, but tension lingered in the air like a prelude to a storm. Candles sputtered as if in warning. One figure stepped forward, his voice low and deliberate. "The knights believe they fight for God, but we know the truth," he said. "Every victory, every conquest, they pass through our hands first. Every banner they raise carries the imprint of our design." The others nodded, a silent acknowledgement of centuries of careful planning. This was a truth too dangerous to speak aloud in public. Yet in this hidden chamber, it was shared as though it were scripture itself. Outside, the world continued its routines, oblivious to the quiet machinations shaping its fate. Merchants counted coins, priests recited prayers, and children dreamed of heroic tales. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, empires rose and fell according to the imperceptible influence of these families. Their networks stretched across continents. Their reach extended from coastal ports to mountainous fortresses, their wealth and intelligence gathering more steadily than any army could march. They traded in secrets as much as in gold, and their loyalty to each other was often as fierce as their rivalry. When a family member was threatened, the consequences rippled silently across the continent, altering decisions, shifting allegiances, and occasionally, rewriting the course of history itself. What made these bloodlines truly formidable was their ability to remain unseen. Kings might call themselves rulers, yet the real power often flowed through hidden channels. Knights could swear fealty, yet their true allegiance could be traced back to whispered instructions delivered long before they even donned their armor. And while historians recorded the battles, the treaties, the rise and fall of dynasties, They rarely captured the invisible web of influence, the quiet, persistent hand that guided the fate of men who believed they were acting independently. The streets of Europe were teeming with the stories of valor and betrayal, yet most overlooked the strings being pulled in the shadows, where families wrote history in secret ink and silent gestures. These families had learned a crucial lesson. The greatest weapon is not the sword, nor the spear, nor even the knight's unwavering loyalty. The greatest weapon is belief, the belief of the people, the knights, the clergy, that they were acting freely with purpose and honor. When knights charged into battle, convinced they were serving God, they were, in reality, serving the strategy of those who understood patience, secrecy, and the subtlety of influence. They had mastered the art of shaping history without ever appearing to do so, a dance of control so elegant that centuries later, scholars would struggle to untangle the threads of truth from the fabric of legend. And yet, for all their patience and cunning, these bloodlines were not invincible. Enemies lurked in unexpected places. Whispers of betrayal could travel faster than a messenger on horseback, and the human heart, capable of love, envy, and ambition, was a variable no plan could fully control. The tension between secrecy and exposure was constant. A ledger misplaced, a conversation overheard, a symbol misinterpreted. Any could tip the balance, unraveling decades of careful orchestration. This precariousness gave every decision weight, every maneuver significance, and every hidden glance the potential to change the course of history forever. In the courtyard, the meeting drew to a close. The participants melted back into the darkness, returning to their homes, their roles, their outwardly ordinary lives. To the rest of the world, they were nobles, merchants, or clerics. To the knights, they were patrons, benefactors, distant authorities to obey and honor. But behind the mask of civility, they were architects of fate, silent witnesses to the rise and fall of orders, kingdoms, and dynasties. Their influence was subtle, pervasive, and enduring. A ghostly hand writing history in the margins, in places where the untrained eye would never think to look. And as the fog thickened and the city slept, the truth lingered, waiting for those curious enough to see it. That behind the chivalry, the piety, and the legendary tales of heroism, there existed families whose ambition and foresight shaped the very course of the knights' destinies. Their stories were not recorded in the chronicles, but they were written in the victories, the alliances, and the silent sacrifices of men and women who believed in causes greater than themselves. And somewhere, in the hidden shadows of Europe, their legacy endured, waiting for the day someone would uncover the secrets they had guarded for centuries. Long before the first knights mounted their horses to ride into the sun-scorched lands of the Holy Land, before the banners of the Crusades fluttered over distant shores, the stage was already being set by families whose ambitions reached far beyond their immediate dominions. These were not merely noble houses seeking prestige or lands. They were dynasties steeped in strategy, secrecy, and a deep understanding of the currents that moved Europe. Their lineage was traced through meticulous records, obscure marriage contracts, and, in some cases, whispered tales preserved only in the hearts of trusted retainers. They were custodians of a power that was invisible to most, yet their influence spread across kingdoms and centuries like the roots of a great tree, unseen beneath the surface but holding the soil together with unyielding strength. In the courts of early medieval Europe, power was never measured purely in banners or armies. It was in blood. It was in the alliances formed in silence, in the calculated marriages that bound one family to another, often across great distances and cultural divides. A daughter married into a neighboring house was more than a bride. She was a vessel of influence, a thread in a web so vast that a single misstep could alter the fortunes of countless lives. Sons were groomed not only in the art of war but in the subtler disciplines of diplomacy, observation, and discretion. A letter, a coin, a small favor could ripple outward with consequences unseen by the untrained eye. It was through these seemingly mundane acts that the bloodlines began their quiet domination, long before the first knights swore their oaths on distant battlefields. The origins of many of these families were humble in appearance, yet their ambition was anything but. They were knights, minor lords, merchants, and clerics who understood that true power rarely comes from the sword alone. comes from influence, information, and patience. Over decades, they amassed wealth, forged alliances, and carefully positioned their descendants to inherit not just lands, but authority. The seeds of their control were planted so subtly that even contemporary chroniclers rarely noticed. They spoke of battles, of kings, of victories and defeats, but seldom of the silent strategists whose counsel shaped the outcomes of those very wars. These families were architects of history, operating in a realm where patience and foresight mattered more than immediate glory. Yet, ambition alone was not enough. These families understood the necessity of discretion. They knew that overt displays of power could provoke envy, suspicion, and even violent reprisal. Therefore, they cultivated a culture of secrecy, employing codes, symbols, and rituals to communicate intentions only to those deemed trustworthy. Heraldry, often dismissed as mere decoration or family pride, became a language of influence. A carefully placed emblem on a shield, a particular pattern woven into a banner, could signal allegiance, warn of danger, or convey a strategy without a single word spoken aloud. Every detail mattered. Every gesture was calculated. In a world where a casual observation could tip the balance of power, nothing was left to chance. Some of these families were particularly skilled at leveraging the emerging religious fervor of the time. They recognized early that piety was a currency as potent as gold, capable of earning them favor, legitimacy, and influence over those who swore oaths in the name of faith. By funding monasteries, sponsoring pilgrimages, or supporting early crusading efforts, they created an aura of sanctity around their names. The knights, devoted to God and sworn to protect the faithful, often did not perceive that their actions might serve the strategic aims of hidden patrons. Faith became intertwined with ambition, a tool wielded not only to inspire devotion, but to secure power in ways that would endure for generations. Travelers of the era sometimes noted the remarkable composure and foresight of certain families. Their estates were meticulously managed, their advisors shrewd and loyal, their networks extending into the courts of distant lands. Merchants, spies, and clerics alike could act as conduits for information, feeding these dynasties knowledge that allowed them to anticipate threats and opportunities. Where others reacted impulsively to crises, these families seemed always to be one step ahead, their decisions shaped by a combination of inherited wisdom and calculated foresight. Every marriage, treaty, and donation was a move on a grand chessboard, a strategy that would unfold over decades, sometimes even centuries. While the knights and armies of Europe were celebrated for their valor, these families were often invisible, operating in the spaces between official records, in the margins of history. Their influence was quiet, subtle, yet undeniable. They could provoke a rebellion with a whisper, shape the outcome of a siege with a timely gift, or ensure the rise of a favored leader through careful counsel and persuasion. The consequences of their decisions were profound, though rarely attributed to them. Generations later, historians might marvel at the sudden success or inexplicable failure of a knightly order, unaware that it was the result of careful planning by a family who had long remained in the shadows. Their foresight also extended to survival. They understood that alliances were fragile and that betrayal was a constant risk. Therefore, they built redundancy into their plans, ensuring that influence could be maintained even if one branch of the family faltered. Trusted retainers, loyal vassals, and carefully cultivated friendships served as buffers, safeguarding the family's position against the unpredictable whims of fortune. They knew that history favors not the strongest warriors alone, but those who can endure, adapt, and manipulate circumstances from behind a veil of secrecy. Yet, for all their cunning, these families were not without human emotion. There was ambition, yes, but also fear, love, envy, and grief. The pressure to secure legacy could weigh heavily, shaping decisions that balanced personal desire with familial duty. Children were often raised in an environment where loyalty to the family's vision eclipsed personal freedom. Yet even in such rigid structures, sparks of individuality persisted. Some resisted, some betrayed, and some emerged as remarkable figures who combined inherited wisdom with their own cunning. These stories, often hidden or lost, reveal the human stakes behind what otherwise might appear as dry political maneuvering. The tension between personal morality and family ambition added depth and complexity to the quiet power struggles that shaped the knights and their world. The most extraordinary aspect of these bloodlines, however, was their patience. While kings rose and fell in a matter of years, and battles were won and lost in days, these families thought in decades. They planted seeds whose fruit would be reaped long after their own deaths, understanding that true influence is measured not by immediate gains, but by the enduring capacity to shape events across generations. The knights, for all their courage and honor, were often playing roles in stories they barely understood, actors on a stage designed and directed by those who understood the subtle mechanics of power. In the quiet corridors of their estates, these families would gather, poring over documents, tracing lineages, and considering future moves. They debated marriages, arranged alliances, and considered the loyalties of far-flung knights and lords. Every decision was weighed not only for immediate benefit but for its potential to influence the generations to come. There was a sense of continuity, a feeling that they were part of a story larger than themselves, a story whose threads would weave through history, unseen yet ever-present. And it was in these moments of careful planning, in the hushed exchanges and cryptic gestures, that the seeds of the knights' destiny were sown. The world outside their estates often perceived the knights as autonomous warriors, heroes of their time, paragons of faith and courage. But behind the spectacle, these bloodlines held sway. Their influence was neither overt nor violent. It was subtle, pervasive, and persistent. They understood that the true measure of power lies not in domination but in orchestration, in shaping outcomes so carefully that others believe they are acting freely. And in this quiet mastery, these families ensured that the knights, so celebrated in stories and legend, were, in many ways, instruments of ambitions far older and deeper than the battles they fought. The legacy of these bloodlines was not written in chronicles, nor sung by bards, nor carved into stone. It was hidden in alliances, in subtle gestures, in the careful arrangement of marriages, gifts, and favors. It was a legacy that endured in silence, shaping the course of the knights and, through them, the destiny of Europe itself. And for those willing to look beyond the tales of valor and devotion, to peer into the shadows behind the banners and chapels, the story became clear that the knights were not merely warriors of faith, but actors in a drama orchestrated by families who understood that true power is always invisible, always patient, and always enduring. The call to crusade echoed across Europe like a sound both divine and urgent, carried on the lips of preachers and the whispers of the ambitious. From the bustling market towns to the grand halls of kings, the words ignited a fire that would sweep through the hearts of men young and old. Take up the cross, they proclaimed, and fight for God. Yet beneath the fervor of faith and the promise of eternal salvation, another force was at work, unseen and yet decisive. The families whose influence had been quietly shaping Europe for generations. They understood that this religious zeal could be harnessed, molded, and directed to serve their own ambitions. The Crusades were not merely holy wars. They were opportunities, and for those who knew how to manipulate destiny, opportunities of unparalleled scale. In the courts of Europe, letters arrived from distant lands, carried by writers whose speed and secrecy ensured that no one could intercept their messages. Families who had long cultivated networks of loyalty and influence now set their plans into motion. Alliances were revisited, marriages hastened or delayed, and resources discreetly allocated to ensure that when knights departed for the Holy Land, their paths would align with the interests of those pulling strings behind the scenes. It was a game of strategy played across continents, yet invisible to most who cheered for the banners and the oaths. To the common eye, these were men and women motivated purely by faith, but to those in the shadows, the stakes were far more tangible. Territory, influence, wealth, and legacy. The knights themselves, adorned in armor and bearing the insignia of their orders, often believed in the righteousness of their mission. They rode with conviction, prepared to spill blood in service of God. Yet the true compass guiding them was often a subtle direction from distant patrons. A choice of route, a decision to aid one lord over another, the distribution of supplies and reinforcements, all were carefully monitored and influenced by the families who understood the calculus of power. Every battle fought, Every city besieged, every treaty signed was entwined with motives unseen by the warriors themselves. Their valor was genuine, their courage unquestioned, but it was channeled toward ends dictated by a lineage whose vision spanned generations. Europe itself seemed to tremble under the weight of these intersecting forces. The ordinary people, unaware of the silent machinations at work, prepared to follow the knights or join the ranks of crusading armies out of piety, fear, or the hope of reward. Meanwhile, the wealthy families, whose fortunes were often intertwined with the success of these campaigns, manipulated financial resources to ensure the success of their chosen orders. Ships were funded, mercenaries employed, and logistics organized with meticulous precision, all while appearing to act in support of God rather than in service of human ambition. The contrast between appearance and reality was stark, yet it was precisely this invisibility that gave them power. As the first contingents of knights gathered at departure points across France, Italy, and Germany, the tension was palpable. Young men, many of noble birth, mounted their horses with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, their hearts filled with devotion and the desire for glory. Yet few understood that their journey had already been charted, their victories anticipated, and their failures accounted for by those who would never be seen on the battlefield. Instructions were delivered quietly, advisors sent under the guise of companions, and financial support subtly allocated to ensure that outcomes favored the long-term designs of the families orchestrating events from afar. The theater of war was immense, yet the directors remained hidden behind a veil of normalcy. The emotional stakes were immense. Knights prepared to face dangers unimaginable, leaving behind families who prayed for their safe return, unaware that those prayers were being observed and subtly influenced by distant patrons. Some parents, while outwardly supportive, were participants in networks of obligation that ensured loyalty, sometimes at the expense of personal desire. The intertwining of faith, family, and power created a tapestry where every thread mattered, where a single choice could reverberate across generations. Even as men charged into battle, their fates were intertwined with invisible hands whose patience and foresight spanned decades. In the Holy Land, the landscape was a harsh mirror of the ambitions that had set these events into motion. Crusader states were established not only through martial skill but through calculated decisions that ensured control over key cities, trade routes, and resources. Families back in Europe, leveraging their networks of spies, envoys, and correspondents, monitored these developments closely. The victories of the knights were celebrated publicly as acts of divine favor, but privately, the real measure of success was the consolidation of influence, the securing of alliances, and the positioning of power that would endure long after the last sword had been sheathed. The lines between piety and pragmatism blurred, leaving a landscape where faith and strategy were inseparable. The manipulation extended beyond the battlefield. Negotiations with local rulers, the distribution of spoils, and the management of newly conquered territories were all carefully guided by these families. Knights often believed they acted independently, yet every decision was subtly shaped to ensure that political and economic advantages favored the patrons who had orchestrated the campaigns. Even acts of heroism were interpreted, encouraged, or amplified to serve strategic narratives. The very notion of glory became intertwined with invisible control, a reflection of human ambition masked as divine approval. And yet, despite all planning, there was uncertainty. The human element, loyalty, courage, fear, and unpredictability, always remained. A knight might defy orders out of conscience, a battle might swing unexpectedly, and alliances might fracture under unforeseen pressures. These moments of chaos, though perilous, were anticipated by those who understood that even apparent disorder could be a tool. Flexibility, foresight, and the ability to adapt to unfolding events were as much a part of the family's strategy as the initial plan itself. They were not omnipotent, but their patience and meticulous attention to detail gave them an almost supernatural command over the course of events. As the first battles unfolded, victories and losses alike were measured not only by immediate outcomes but by their implications for influence and legacy. Families carefully noted which knights displayed loyalty, which commanders could be relied upon, and which territories offered strategic advantage. Each success was a stepping stone, each setback a lesson, integrated into a broader vision that spanned generations. Even those who died heroically on foreign soil contributed to the long-term calculus, their actions recorded, remembered, and, in some cases, used to justify further maneuvers in Europe. The Crusades were not merely a series of conflicts. They were a complex interplay of faith, ambition, and inheritance, orchestrated with a precision invisible to the casual observer. By the time the campaigns drew to a close, the scope of influence exercised by these families was staggering. They had shaped not only the fates of men and kingdoms but also the course of culture, trade, and religion across continents. The knights returned, battle-weary and changed, often unaware that the successes they celebrated were guided by hands they could not see. Their glory was genuine, yet it was entwined with a tapestry of ambition woven over generations. Those who had orchestrated events remained in the shadows, their presence suggested only by subtle patterns, whispered stories, and the invisible lines of power that connected one victory to the next. And so, the Crusades left behind more than ruins and relics. They left a landscape of influence carefully cultivated by those who had anticipated every move. The knights, revered for courage and piety, were instruments of visions shaped not by chance, but by families whose ambitions and patience had spanned generations. Europe itself was transformed, yet the true architects remained invisible, their legacy written not in chronicles or monuments, but in the quiet, persistent power that continued to shape events long after the banners had been lowered. For those who look closely, the pattern emerges. The Crusades were not merely wars of faith. They were the proving ground of ambition, the stage upon which hidden bloodlines demonstrated their mastery over men, history, and destiny itself. The formation of the knightly orders was a spectacle of contrasts, a convergence of devout faith and worldly ambition. On one hand, there were men who took solemn vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, committing themselves to the protection of pilgrims and the defense of Christendom. On the other, there were forces of influence, families whose wealth, intelligence, and foresight had quietly guided the creation of these orders from the shadows. The orders themselves seemed like holy institutions, carved from ideals of sacrifice and courage, yet behind their gilded facades, decisions were often driven by politics, inheritance, and the ambitions of those who never donned armor. The knights were public heroes, but the architects of their paths remained invisible, their impact woven delicately into the fabric of history. In the chapels where the knights swore their oaths, candlelight flickered against stone walls, casting elongated shadows that seemed to merge with the sacred. Priests spoke of duty to God, yet the true power lay elsewhere. Families who had sponsored the construction of these orders ensured that key positions were occupied by men favorable to their influence. Commanders were chosen not solely for valor or piety, but for their reliability in executing a vision that transcended immediate concerns. Loyalty, courage, and honor were expected, but they were secondary to alignment with the hidden network of power. In effect, the knights themselves became instruments, their devotion harnessed and subtly guided to serve ambitions that were invisible even to the most observant among them. The contrast between the austere lives of the knights and the opulence of their patrons was striking. While many knights fasted, prayed, and endured the hardships of war, the families behind them maintained estates adorned with tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, and treasures accumulated over generations. Wealth in their hands was a tool of influence, a means to direct the course of events without resorting to open confrontation. By providing resources, arranging marriages, and offering strategic guidance, they ensured that the knights' actions, however heroic, ultimately reinforced their own interests. This careful orchestration created a tension between appearance and reality. The knights were celebrated for their virtues, yet the framework within which they operated was designed for purposes beyond the battlefield. Even in their most private moments, knights were subject to the subtle pressures of these hidden patrons. Letters and directives arrived from distant lands, often delivered under the guise of orders from the church or the crown, but carrying instructions intended to align with the ambitions of influential families. A decision about which town to aid, which siege to prioritize, or which noble to support was rarely made in isolation. Each choice could alter the balance of power, not only in the immediate region but across Europe, shaping alliances and rivalries for generations. The knights were instruments of both faith and strategy, their actions choreographed in a grand design that only the families behind the scenes fully understood. The formation of the orders was also a crucible for human drama. Men from disparate regions, backgrounds, and social strata were brought together under a common purpose. Yet each carried personal ambitions, fears, and doubts. The patrons who guided the orders understood the psychology of these men intimately. They knew which knights were ambitious and which were cautious, which could be trusted and which might falter. By subtly encouraging certain behaviors and discouraging others, they shaped not only the success of military campaigns but the internal culture of the orders themselves. Loyalty was cultivated, rivalries managed, and potential threats neutralized before they could disrupt the delicate balance of power. The paradox of the knightly orders was evident in their paradoxical lives. Men sworn to humility yet participating in campaigns that brought wealth and renown. Men devoted to God yet guided by secular strategies. Men whose courage was genuine, yet whose decisions were subtly influenced by unseen hands. This duality created a landscape of tension and intrigue, where every act of valor was shadowed by questions of motive, and every strategic choice reflected a blend of faith and human ambition. The knights' legacy was celebrated in chronicles and tales, yet the hidden orchestration behind their successes remained invisible to most, a secret carefully preserved by the families who had orchestrated their rise. The architecture of the order's headquarters, often grandiose and fortified, mirrored this duality. To the casual observer, these were symbols of religious devotion and military discipline. To those who understood the networks of influence, the structures were instruments of control. Strategic locations were chosen not only for defense but to monitor trade routes, political borders, and rival territories. Rooms were designed for councils, archives, and secret deliberations, spaces where sensitive information could be exchanged without detection. Even the smallest details, the placement of a chapel, the orientation of a hall, the symbols carved into stone, carried meaning for those who knew how to read them. Every aspect of the order's physical presence was intertwined with the ambitions of their patrons, a tangible manifestation of invisible influence. The knights' oaths were a performance of devotion, yet they were also a contract with a broader vision. Men were bound by sacred promises, yet those promises intersected with the expectations of families who had invested not only wealth but strategy into their success. It was a delicate balance. Enforce too rigid a control, and the knights might resist. Allow too much autonomy, and the carefully constructed plans could unravel. The patrons' genius lay in their subtlety, their ability to guide without appearing to govern, to influence without commanding, and to secure outcomes without exposure. The orders flourished, their fame spreading across Europe, yet the family's influence remained largely unrecognized by the chroniclers of the day. Human stories flourished within this framework. Knights wrestled with doubt, courage, and ambition, unaware of the broader forces shaping their paths. Friendships were forged and tested, rivalries sparked by both personal pride and unseen pressures. Love, loss, and betrayal occurred under the watchful eyes of patrons whose interest was not in the individual's happiness, but in the alignment of their choices with the grand strategy. The tension between personal integrity and imposed expectation was a constant undertone, adding layers of complexity and drama to a world already rich with heroism and sacrifice. Even the spiritual elements of the orders were shaped by these hidden influences. Relics, prayers, and holy sites were emphasized or de-emphasized based on their utility in reinforcing loyalty, consolidating control, or legitimizing power. Pilgrimages and campaigns were not solely acts of devotion. They were carefully timed and guided to strengthen alliances, secure territories, and consolidate influence. Faith remained genuine, yet it was a tool wielded with precision, a lever in a grand mechanism of strategy. The line between spiritual inspiration and tactical manipulation was blurred, creating a landscape where devotion and ambition were inseparable, and every act carried consequences far beyond what the knights themselves might perceive. By the time the first generations of knights had established themselves as a formidable presence across Europe and the Holy Land, the families behind the orders had achieved a remarkable feat. They had created institutions that appeared autonomous, devoted entirely to religious and martial ideals, yet were subtly directed by networks of influence that spanned continents. The knights' valor, courage and reputation were celebrated publicly, but every success was, in some measure, a reflection of careful planning and patient orchestration. The true architects of this system remained in the shadows, unseen but omnipresent, their vision unfolding slowly and meticulously over decades. And so the paradox of the knightly orders endured. Men devoted to God, yet guided by ambition. Orders celebrated for their piety, yet shaped by secrecy. Battles won through courage, yet orchestrated by invisible hands. The tension between appearance and reality, between faith and strategy, became the defining characteristic of the early knights. Their stories, told in chronicles and legends, spoke of heroism and devotion. Yet beneath every tale lay the imprint of families whose vision and patience had shaped not only the orders themselves but the destiny of Europe. For those who look closely, the truth emerges. The knights were not merely men of faith and valor. They were instruments, carefully honed, guided, and preserved by dynasties whose ambitions and influence stretched far beyond the battlefield. Long before the banners of the knightly orders were seen on distant battlefields, there existed a network of patrons whose influence was subtle yet absolute. These were men and women who rarely appeared in chronicles, whose names were whispered only in courtly circles or hidden in the margins of family records. Yet their reach extended across kingdoms and crusader states alike. They were the financiers, advisors, and silent directors whose wealth and foresight made possible the campaigns that would later be immortalized in tales of chivalry. Knights rode with courage and conviction, yet often without realizing that their paths, victories, and even their defeats had been carefully orchestrated by forces that operated far from the sight of common men. To these patrons, the knights were not merely warriors of faith. They were instruments in a game of influence, and every decision, every maneuver, served the larger ambition of families determined to shape history in secret. The influence of these patrons began with wealth, yet it was wealth employed with precision, strategy, and a remarkable understanding of human nature. Castles, fortresses, and military campaigns were funded with an eye toward control rather than spectacle. Donations to religious orders, ostensibly acts of piety, were often designed to secure loyalty, establish influence, or manipulate the perception of knights who believed themselves acting independently. It was a delicate balance. Too overt a display of power could provoke suspicion or rebellion, yet subtle enough and the results could be extraordinary. The direction of battles, the allegiance of commanders, and the ultimate success of campaigns could all be guided without a single sword being drawn. These patrons mastered the art of invisible control, achieving outcomes that seemed miraculous or divinely inspired to the world outside their hidden chambers. Their methods were as diverse as they were ingenious. Some employed marriages to bind promising knights to their influence, ensuring loyalty through family ties and obligations that could not be easily broken. Others relied on correspondence, sending coded messages, instructions, or even subtle encouragements that nudged decisions in their favor. A particular shipment of armor or weaponry might be delayed or accelerated, not due to necessity, but to ensure that a battle unfolded in a manner advantageous to the patron's long-term strategy. Knights often swore oaths to God, yet their actions were influenced by human hands whose motives were grounded in ambition, legacy, and power. Faith and loyalty became intertwined with subtle manipulation, creating a complex dance where every gesture carried multiple layers of significance. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of these hidden patrons was their ability to remain invisible while wielding influence that shaped entire campaigns. Chronicles celebrated knightly valor, yet few ever questioned how decisions were made in the heat of battle or why certain leaders achieved extraordinary success while others faltered. Behind the scenes, patrons ensured that capable commanders received the support they needed, that strategic alliances were fostered, and that rivalries were managed in ways that strengthened their networks of influence. They understood human psychology, predicting the actions of men driven by faith, ambition, pride, and fear. By anticipating responses and subtly guiding behavior, they could orchestrate outcomes that appeared natural, earned, and inevitable, yet were anything but accidental. Some patrons went further, embedding symbols, messages, or instructions within the very culture of the orders. Heraldic emblems, the arrangement of banners, or even the timing of ceremonies could communicate allegiance, convey warnings, or signal strategy to those attuned to the hidden language of influence. Knights, immersed in ritual and tradition, might recognize only the surface meaning, while the true message remained concealed to all but a select few. This mastery of subtlety ensured that control was maintained without exposure, a delicate balance that required intelligence, patience, and an intimate understanding of both the men they guided and the broader currents of history. The stakes for these patrons were not purely political or financial. They were deeply personal. Legacy was paramount. Each decision, each maneuver, was intended to secure the family's influence for generations to come. The lives of knights, the outcomes of battles, the rise or fall of neighboring dynasties, all were measured not merely by immediate consequence but by their long-term impact on the family's standing. These patrons viewed time differently, thinking in decades and centuries rather than years. Their vision extended beyond the lifespan of any single knight, commander, or king. The actions of the present were only meaningful insofar as they contributed to the enduring strategy of influence, control, and legacy. The emotional complexity of their control was significant as well. Patrons often grappled with loyalty and morality, balancing the human cost of their maneuvers against the perceived necessity of achieving their strategic objectives. Knights were both allies and instruments, their bravery admired yet always secondary to the overarching plan. When a knight fell in battle or a campaign faltered, it was a calculated risk weighed against potential gains, an emotional calculus that few could comprehend. Yet within this cold strategy lay a recognition of human courage, of devotion, of the unpredictability that made history alive and compelling. Patrons admired these qualities even as they harnessed them, a paradox that infused their power with both awe and a shadowed melancholy. Geography, too, was a tool in the hands of these families. They understood that the placement of knights, the control of cities, and the protection of trade routes could be manipulated to serve broader ambitions. The flow of information, the distribution of supplies, and the positioning of forces were all part of a carefully calibrated network. A city fortified at precisely the right moment, a river crossing defended with just enough force, a convoy redirected or delayed, all could shape the course of history. Knights, unaware of the invisible architecture guiding their actions, believed themselves acting on instinct or divine inspiration, while in reality they were following a path subtly carved by patrons whose foresight was measured in generations. Even their enemies were part of the design. Rival families, competing orders, and rebellious factions were anticipated, their moves predicted and neutralized through a combination of diplomacy, strategic marriages, and the careful allocation of resources. The patrons understood that influence extended beyond direct control. It was about shaping the environment in which others operated, ensuring that even those who appeared independent were, in some way, playing into a larger design. Conflict, alliances, and reconciliation all became instruments in the orchestration of power, creating a tapestry of influence so complex that only those at the very center could perceive its full scope. Stone walls rose from the earth like ancient sentinels, their surfaces weathered by wind and rain, yet unyielding, silent witnesses to centuries of human ambition. Castles and fortresses were more than mere defenses. They were statements, symbols, and, in many ways, instruments of power. Every stone, every arch, every hidden corridor was carefully considered, not merely for its strength against invaders, but for the subtle messages it conveyed to those who understood the language of influence. The families who had orchestrated the rise of the knightly orders had learned that control could be exercised as effectively through architecture as through armies. These fortresses became physical embodiments of their power, monuments to secrecy, strategy, and foresight. From the outside, a fortress might appear straightforward. Thick walls, towers to survey the surrounding lands, gates fortified against attack. But for those who looked closer, a deeper complexity emerged. Hidden chambers, secret passages, and concealed storage spaces were scattered throughout, designed to protect treasures, documents, and even people. Knights might occupy these spaces without fully comprehending the intentions behind their design. The layouts facilitated not only defense but observation and control. Courtyards could funnel visitors along predetermined paths, towers could serve as watchpoints and symbols of vigilance, and hidden rooms could store records that chronicled alliances and debts, messages intended only for the eyes of those capable of interpreting them. The fortresses themselves became silent instruments of influence, their architecture a reflection of the careful planning that had guided the orders and the families behind them. Even the placement of these strongholds was never accidental. Strategic locations were chosen to dominate trade routes, monitor political borders, and exert subtle pressure on neighboring territories. Rivers, mountains, and hills were studied with precision, ensuring that each fortress could serve multiple purposes: a refuge, a command center, and a hub for intelligence. From a distance, these castles projected strength and stability, deterring rivals and inspiring loyalty. Yet at the same time, they allowed the patron's influence to flow invisibly, enabling them to guide the movements of armies, knights, and emissaries without ever stepping onto the battlefield themselves. Every choice was deliberate, every construction a piece of a larger strategy spanning generations. Inside these fortresses, symbolism was woven into the very fabric of daily life. Carvings, frescoes, and heraldic motifs were not merely decorative. They communicated lineage, allegiance, and hidden loyalties. A knight or officer might notice the symbols and feel pride or reassurance, unaware that these images were deliberately selected to reinforce obedience and subtly remind them of the unseen power guiding their actions. In some cases, patterns and emblems served as codes, transmitting messages to those attuned to their meanings. Even the arrangement of furniture, the positioning of chapels, and the orientation of walls could carry significance. Every detail, no matter how minor it seemed, was part of a carefully orchestrated narrative, an architectural language that the families had mastered over generations. Fortresses also functioned as hubs of intelligence. Letters and reports passed discreetly between chambers and courtyards, and trusted messengers moved silently through secret passages. Spies, allies, and informants could relay critical information without attracting attention. The families who controlled the knights understood that knowledge was as crucial as weaponry, and that control over information could be exercised as effectively as control over armies. A well-timed message could alter a campaign, shift alliances, or prevent rebellion. Fortresses were thus not only symbols of military strength but nodes in a vast network of influence, where power was exercised subtly and strategically, far from the eyes of historians or chroniclers. Beyond the functional, there was a psychological dimension to these constructions. The imposing presence of a fortress, rising high on a hill or dominating a valley, had a profound effect on those who approached it. It inspired awe and obedience, a reminder of authority that was both visible and intangible. Knights entering such a stronghold might feel an unspoken pressure to perform, to live up to the expectations conveyed not through words, but through walls, towers, and hidden inscriptions. Patrons understood that architecture could shape behavior, instill discipline, and reinforce loyalty, subtly bending human action to serve long-term strategy. Even fear could be employed as a tool. A hidden dungeon, a shadowed corridor, or a distant battlement could suggest omnipresence, creating an environment where obedience became almost instinctual. The fortresses also served as repositories of legacy. Important documents, records of lineage, financial ledgers, and accounts of alliances were carefully stored in secure chambers. These were not merely practical necessities but instruments of enduring influence. Knowledge of debts, obligations, and loyalties allowed families to control relationships long after the immediate events had passed. The knights, unaware of the significance of many documents, acted in ways that ultimately reinforced the patron's long-term vision. The walls of these fortresses preserved both history and strategy, silently chronicling decisions and outcomes, ensuring that influence could be maintained across generations. In times of war, the fortresses became theaters of subtle manipulation. Knights might be assigned to certain garrisons, battles orchestrated to favor particular outcomes, and supplies distributed in ways that reinforced broader strategic objectives. From a distance, the battles appeared to be contests of valor, courage, and divine will. Yet the reality was that the invisible hand of the families guided the flow of events, ensuring that the outcomes aligned with long-term plans. Fortresses were both stage and director, shaping the movements of armies and the decisions of commanders with precision. They were living instruments of strategy, blending the practical, the symbolic, and the psychological into a cohesive whole. Even the cultural and religious aspects of fortress life were influenced by these patrons. Chapels, altars, and relics were strategically placed, not only for worship but to cultivate loyalty, reinforce hierarchy, and subtly direct attention to the patron's values and priorities. Pilgrimages and ceremonial events were used to display power and reinforce bonds, while maintaining the appearance of piety and devotion. Every aspect of life within a fortress was orchestrated to serve both visible and hidden objectives, creating an environment where faith, duty, and ambition intersected seamlessly. Knights might perceive these rituals as purely spiritual, yet they were inextricably linked to the strategic vision of the families who had designed their very existence. Despite the strength and foresight embedded in these fortresses, they were also vulnerable to human unpredictability. Knights could act against expectations, alliances could fracture, and unforeseen circumstances could disrupt even the most meticulous plans. Yet the families who orchestrated these constructions had accounted for contingencies, embedding redundancy into their networks and ensuring that influence could adapt to unexpected developments. Secret passages, hidden caches, and layered intelligence networks allowed for flexibility, turning potential disasters into opportunities for consolidating power. The fortresses, in essence, were not static monuments. They were dynamic instruments of control, capable of responding to the unpredictable nature of human action while maintaining the patron's long-term vision. By the time the knightly orders reached the height of their influence, these fortresses stood as enduring symbols of both faith and strategy. They projected power, inspired loyalty, and preserved knowledge, all while serving as instruments of invisible control. Power in the medieval world was rarely exercised in isolation. It was woven, layer by layer, into a network of relationships, alliances, and obligations that extended across kingdoms, cities, and even continents. The hidden families who guided the knights understood this better than anyone. They moved with quiet precision, linking one house to another through marriages, oaths, and strategic favors, creating a lattice of influence so intricate that few could perceive its full design. These connections were not simply political expedients. They were instruments of control, subtle mechanisms that ensured loyalty, cultivated trust, and allowed influence to flow like an invisible current beneath the surface of apparent independence. Every handshake, every marriage contract, every gift exchanged carried weight far beyond the immediate moment, a reminder that power often resides in the invisible threads that bind human lives together. The marriages arranged by these families were especially potent. A daughter married into a rival house could diffuse tension, solidify allegiance, or even manipulate succession, while a son might be positioned to inherit influence across multiple territories. These unions were carefully orchestrated, taking into account lineage, temperament, and potential for loyalty. The families understood that human emotion could be both a tool and a liability. Marriages that appeared advantageous in terms of property or title could also produce bonds of affection that reinforced allegiance, or, conversely, generate resentment and rebellion if mishandled. In every case, the dynamics of love, loyalty, and duty were exploited with subtlety and foresight, ensuring that the flow of power remained uninterrupted. Oaths and pledges added another layer of security to these networks. Knights, lords, and even minor nobles were often bound by personal promises that were invisible to outsiders. A casual nod, a shared meal, or a whispered agreement could solidify a bond that would influence military campaigns, territorial negotiations, or succession disputes decades later. Families who controlled the knights maintained meticulous records of these commitments, tracking obligations and debts that could be called upon when needed. The knights themselves often believed these relationships were born of mutual respect or camaraderie, unaware that they had been woven into a broader strategy of influence designed to extend the patron's reach across time and space. The network extended beyond marriage and oaths. Gifts, financial support, and political favors were deployed with precision to encourage compliance or reward loyalty. A shipment of arms might be redirected to a favored commander, a loan quietly guaranteed to ensure allegiance, a rare relic presented at the perfect moment to reinforce devotion and obedience. Each act was calculated, its immediate benefit intertwined with long-term strategic advantage. Knights believed they were acting out of honor or devotion, yet every decision, every shift in allegiance, had been anticipated and subtly guided by the families who had orchestrated these interactions for generations. Rivalries and conflicts were managed in equally subtle ways. Competing families, potential threats, and rebellious knights were seldom confronted directly. Instead, influence was exercised through negotiation, persuasion, and the careful manipulation of circumstance. A minor skirmish might be encouraged to test loyalty, a dispute over land could be mediated to favor a chosen faction, or a marriage arranged to neutralize a potential adversary. By controlling the environment in which their rivals operated, these families could ensure that outcomes aligned with their long-term vision, often without revealing their hand. The result was a landscape of power in which even opposition contributed to the consolidation of control, a testament to the sophistication of their strategy. Communication was key. Letters, emissaries, and messengers moved silently across Europe, carrying instructions, information, and subtle cues that guided the actions of knights and allies. Codes and symbols were employed to maintain secrecy, ensuring that only those trained in the family's intricate system could interpret the messages correctly. Knights believed themselves free agents, yet their movements, decisions, and alliances were often influenced by directives that originated far from the battlefield. Every campaign, every negotiation, and every diplomatic encounter was shaped by a lattice of influence designed to maximize loyalty and minimize disruption. The family's control was both pervasive and invisible, their presence felt even when their names were absent from the record. The emotional dimension of these alliances cannot be overstated. Human loyalty is rarely absolute, and the patrons understood that fear, admiration, respect, and even love could be harnessed to reinforce obedience. Knights who felt a deep personal connection to a family were more likely to act in ways that aligned with the family's objectives, sometimes even at great personal risk. Conversely, resentment or suspicion could be redirected or mitigated through careful management of relationships, ensuring that potential threats were neutralized before they became dangerous. Influence was a delicate balance of respect, obligation, and subtle coercion, executed with skill and foresight to maintain control without resorting to open force. The complexity of these networks was compounded by their longevity. Decisions made in one generation could resonate for decades. As marriages produced heirs, alliances solidified over time, and loyalty was passed from one knight to another. Families thought in terms of centuries, building structures, both physical and relational, that would endure beyond the lifespans of the individuals involved. A carefully placed marriage, a well-timed act of generosity, or a strategic alliance could ripple outward through time, shaping the destiny of knights, territories, and even entire kingdoms. Influence was not fleeting. It was a continuum, an unbroken chain of strategy, foresight, and careful calculation. Even the most heroic actions of knights were often shaped by these invisible hands. A daring charge, a meticulously planned siege, or a brilliant diplomatic negotiation might appear spontaneous or divinely inspired, yet behind the scenes, patrons had guided the conditions that allowed such feats to occur. By arranging alliances, influencing resources, and shaping the environment in which events unfolded, these families ensured that the knight's courage served not only God, but also a broader, hidden vision. Valor became intertwined with strategy, heroism inseparable from manipulation, and the distinction between divine will and human ambition blurred into a complex tapestry of influence. Yet for all the calculation and foresight, uncertainty remained. Human nature is unpredictable, and no network, however sophisticated, could anticipate every action. Knights might act impulsively, rival families could challenge expectations, and unforeseen events could disrupt the most meticulous plans. The patrons accounted for this by creating redundancy within their networks, cultivating multiple channels of influence, and ensuring that the web of alliances was resilient. Even in the face of chaos, control could be maintained. Flexibility, adaptability, and a deep understanding of human behavior allowed the families to respond to unpredictability while keeping the broader strategy intact. The result was a world in which loyalty, marriage, and alliance were as powerful as any sword or siege engine. Knights operated within a lattice of influence that guided their actions without ever revealing the presence of the architects behind it. Every handshake, every contract, every familial bond became a tool, a channel through which power flowed invisibly, securing the objectives of those who understood the long game. The complexity and subtlety of this network ensured that influence was maintained over generations, that knights acted in ways that reinforced the family's vision, and that history itself bent subtly, invisibly, toward the ambitions of those who moved behind the scenes. In the end, the web of alliances was not simply a mechanism of control. It was a living testament to the intelligence, patience, and foresight of the families who had cultivated it. Knights, celebrated for their bravery and devotion, were guided in ways they could rarely perceive, their loyalty subtly directed by invisible hands. Every decision, every battle, every marriage, and every oath was a thread in a vast, intricate tapestry, a design that shaped Europe far beyond the battlefield. The families remained largely unseen, their names absent from chronicles, yet their influence was undeniable, enduring, and profound. For those willing to look closely, the story became clear. Power in the Age of Knights was as much about relationships, alliances, and loyalty as it was about steel and courage, and the invisible threads of influence were often the most decisive of all. The Knights Templar, shrouded in legend and cloaked in mystery, were more than the fearsome warriors whose exploits echoed across Europe and the Holy Land. From their inception, they were intricately linked to families whose ambition and foresight extended far beyond mere battlefield triumphs. These families recognized the Templars not simply as a religious or military order, but as instruments, tools through which influence, wealth, and political power could be extended across kingdoms and continents. While the knights themselves were devoted to God and bound by oaths of obedience, their actions were subtly guided by patrons who understood the broader implications of every battle, every treaty, and every acquisition of land or treasure. Valor and devotion were real, yet their direction often traced back to hands unseen. The Templars' appeal to these hidden patrons was immediate and compelling. Here was an organization with discipline, wealth, and military skill, yet one that could be influenced from afar through funding, counsel, and strategic positioning. Families understood that by supporting the order, they could gain access to its vast resources: gold, estates, and even the confidence of European monarchs who looked to the Templars for both martial and financial expertise. Donations and endowments were rarely acts of pure generosity. Every gift was calculated to reinforce loyalty, shape priorities, and ensure that the knight's allegiance extended, however subtly, toward the family's long-term vision. Through the Templars, influence could be exercised across regions that a single noble household could never control alone. From the earliest campaigns, families took a keen interest in the order's activities. They placed trusted agents and allies in positions of influence within the Templars, subtly guiding strategy and allocation of resources. A commander might be encouraged to favor one route over another, or to prioritize certain alliances that would benefit the patron's broader networks. Even seemingly minor logistical decisions, how supplies were distributed, which fortresses were reinforced first, were influenced by the hidden hands directing the flow of power. The knights, for all their skill and bravery, often believed themselves acting on divine inspiration or their own judgment, yet in reality, they were operating within a framework carefully designed to align with the ambitions of those who watched from afar. The order's wealth only amplified this influence. Vast estates, treasuries, and donations flowed into Templar hands, creating an organization capable of extraordinary feats. Families behind the scenes understood that control over wealth equaled control over action. By funding campaigns, endowing fortresses, and managing the allocation of resources, they could ensure that the Templars' decisions, whether to wage a siege, defend a city, or negotiate a treaty, aligned with strategic objectives that extended far beyond immediate religious or military concerns. Knights were celebrated as paragons of courage, yet the infrastructure that enabled their successes was often a testament to the careful orchestration of patrons operating in the shadows. Even the selection of leaders within the Templars bore the imprint of these families. While merit, piety, and battlefield skill were important, influence determined who ascended to positions where decisions could have the greatest impact. Commanders aligned with the patron's vision were favored, while those whose loyalty was uncertain might be sidelined, reassigned, or subtly undermined. Leadership within the order became a reflection not just of individual ability but of alignment with a hidden network of influence, a network designed to ensure that the Templars served purposes far broader than those recorded in official chronicles. The psychological control exerted over knights was as subtle as it was effective. Symbols, rituals, and ceremonies reinforced loyalty, reminding the order of obligations that extended beyond the immediate call of duty. Knights were imbued with a sense of higher purpose, yet the order's priorities were often calibrated to serve the strategic aims of influential families. The line between divine calling and human manipulation was intentionally blurred, creating an environment in which devotion and obedience converged seamlessly with long-term planning. Valor became a conduit through which the ambitions of patrons flowed, and heroism was subtly channeled to reinforce broader objectives that the knights themselves could scarcely articulate. Intelligence and information networks amplified this influence. Families utilized spies, envoys, and intermediaries to monitor the Templars' actions, ensuring that campaigns unfolded as anticipated. Reports of troop movements, battle outcomes, and political developments were transmitted across Europe, allowing patrons to adjust their strategies and intervene when necessary. Knights might have believed themselves independent actors, yet every maneuver, whether on a battlefield in the Levant or within a European court, could be subtly shaped by the flow of information controlled by these families. Knowledge, more than force, became a defining instrument of power. The stakes of this influence were profound. The Templars controlled not only land and wealth but trust and perception. Monarchs relied on their guidance, local populations depended on their protection, and entire campaigns were influenced by their decisions. Families who understood and guided the order could extend their reach into areas far beyond their immediate territories, shaping the political and economic landscape of Europe and the Near East. Through subtle guidance, they could ensure that alliances favored their interests, rivals were constrained, and opportunities were seized precisely when conditions were optimal. Knights, acting with apparent independence, were in effect instruments of a vision that had been decades, or even generations, in the making. Yet influence was never absolute. Human nature introduced unpredictability. Knights could defy expectations, commanders could make unanticipated decisions, and circumstances on the battlefield could shift rapidly. Patrons anticipated this unpredictability, however, and designed their influence to be resilient, layered, and adaptable. Multiple channels of loyalty, redundancy in leadership, and the cultivation of allies across different orders ensured that the broader strategy could endure despite the chaos of human action. Even failures were absorbed and redirected, transforming potential setbacks into opportunities to reinforce influence and consolidate power. The emotional weight of this orchestration was significant. Patrons were not merely strategists. They were deeply invested in the outcomes of the Templars' campaigns. Success reinforced the family's prestige, secured alliances, and validated decades of careful planning, while failure could carry devastating consequences. Yet the families were often emotionally detached from individual knights, viewing them as instruments rather than ends in themselves. This delicate balance of admiration, expectation, and control created a dynamic in which human courage was harnessed, celebrated, and, at times, sacrificed for a vision that transcended immediate life or death. The Templars' heroism became intertwined with ambition, creating a tapestry in which devotion and strategy were inseparable. Even the Order's mysteries, its secret rituals, hidden archives, and coded communications, were part of the family's strategy. Knowledge was power, and the guardianship of information allowed patrons to shape decisions subtly. A relic displayed at the right time could reinforce loyalty, a cryptic message could guide action, and a ritual could instill obedience, all while maintaining the appearance of divine authority. The interplay between secrecy and influence ensured that control could be exercised without overt coercion, a hallmark of the patron's subtle mastery over the order. By the height of their influence, these families had effectively created a system in which the Templars operated as both independent warriors and instruments of invisible strategy. The order's public image of courage, devotion, and divine purpose masked the complexity of the forces shaping its actions. Battles, alliances, and territories were all influenced by a network of families whose foresight, patience, and subtlety had enabled them to guide events far beyond what knights or monarchs might perceive. To the outside world, the Templars were paragons of faith and valor. Behind the veil, they were conduits for ambitions that reached across Europe and the Holy Land, their paths charted by the invisible architects who had recognized the Order's potential from the very beginning. And so, the Templars became more than an order of knights. They became a stage upon which the ambitions, foresight, and strategic genius of hidden families were displayed. Their victories were celebrated, their courage revered, yet the forces guiding them remained largely invisible, shaping history in ways few could perceive. The Order itself, while devoted to God, served as a conduit for human ambition, a remarkable intersection of faith, courage, and the subtle orchestration of power that would echo across centuries and leave an indelible mark on the history of Europe and the world. The night the Templars fell was one shrouded in shadow and whispered fear, a night when the very air seemed thick with anticipation and dread. Torches flickered against the stone walls of Paris, their light casting elongated, trembling shadows that seemed to reach for the heavens and yet trembled with the weight of human treachery. The streets were quiet, unnaturally so, as if the city itself sensed the storm brewing in its heart. Inside the fortified walls of the Templar headquarters, knights slept or tried to, oblivious to the danger approaching, trusting in their oaths, their training, and the sanctity of their cause. Yet even within these walls, the invisible hand of ambition was about to strike, revealing how fragile the boundary between loyalty and betrayal could be when power was at stake. In the months leading up to that night, tension had been mounting. Rumors of royal suspicion, of debts unpaid, and of alliances threatened had begun to circulate among the corridors of the Templars' power. Families that had long influenced the Order's actions watched carefully, some maneuvering to protect their investments, others seizing the opportunity to remove rivals from positions of influence. The knights, renowned for their discipline and courage, had little sense of the forces aligning against them. They had faced enemies on battlefields, endured sieges, and navigated the treacherous politics of the Holy Land, yet nothing had prepared them for the betrayal that would come from within Europe itself. A betrayal orchestrated not by a sword, but by kings, ministers, and advisors who understood how to wield fear as effectively as any weapon. As midnight approached, the city seemed to hold its breath. Royal guards, cloaked in authority and secrecy, moved silently through the winding streets, their presence unseen yet palpably threatening. They converged upon Templar houses, gates unbarred by loyalty, doors opened under the weight of carefully arranged obedience, and knights awoke to the sudden clash of steel and the authoritative voices of arrest. Panic erupted in whispers first, then in shouts, as men who had trained for war against enemies across continents found themselves facing the inexorable force of betrayal at home. Confusion, fear, and disbelief coursed through the Order as they realized the gravity of the night. The emotional impact was immediate and profound. Knights who had fought side by side for years, bonded through blood, battle, and oath, were torn from their companions. Some attempted resistance, only to be overpowered by the overwhelming coordination of forces acting on orders from those whose ambitions demanded the eradication of perceived threats. Others submitted, their faith in justice and loyalty to their oaths compelling them to endure the humiliation, hoping that reason and honor might protect them. In that tense darkness, the contrast between the Templars' valor and the cunning of their enemies could not have been more stark. Courage, once a shield against foreign foes, now seemed almost irrelevant in the face of orchestrated treachery. The arrests were meticulously planned. No castle, no stronghold, no fortified house was spared. The timing, the placement of guards, the knowledge of secret passages and hidden rooms, all had been anticipated. Families with interests in controlling outcomes had ensured that betrayals were executed with precision, striking at the heart of the Order simultaneously across regions. It was a masterstroke of strategy and human manipulation, a demonstration that power exercised in shadows could achieve what brute force alone might never accomplish. Knights were captured, accused, and bound, leaving behind an Order suddenly stripped of its autonomy and authority. The very institutions that had once represented honor, faith, and discipline were thrown into chaos, their leaders humiliated, imprisoned, or executed. In the courtyards and chambers, whispers of betrayal carried through the stone walls. Men questioned how loyalty could be so easily undermined, how trust could be weaponized against those who had devoted their lives to virtue and God. Families who had influenced the knights from afar watched closely, some maneuvering to protect their interests, others eager to capitalize on the sudden vacuum of power. The intricate web of alliances and influence that had sustained the Templars for generations now became a battlefield in its own right, with competing families jockeying for advantage, ensuring that the collapse of one order would strengthen their long-term position. Even amidst the immediate tragedy, the unseen architects of history moved like shadows across the chessboard of Europe, directing events with patience and precision. The human cost was immense. Knights who had believed in the sanctity of their order, who had sacrificed everything for a higher calling, now faced humiliation, torture, and in some cases execution. Families that had cultivated loyalty found their plans disrupted, and the delicate balance of influence carefully maintained over decades trembled under the weight of fear and uncertainty. The city itself seemed to echo the chaos, torches flickering as if reflecting the collective anxiety, the sense that an era of faith and order had been shattered by ambition and betrayal. Every corner, every shadow, seemed charged with menace, and the boundaries between friend and foe blurred in the cold glow of torchlight. Yet, even in the midst of devastation, the subtle genius of the patrons behind the arrests became evident. Those families who had previously guided the Templars now ensured that the redistribution of power would benefit them. Rivals were eliminated, influence consolidated, and new opportunities for control were created. The knights, though courageous and devout, had been instruments in a larger design, an orchestration that revealed the fragility of honor when confronted by the meticulous application of power and strategy. Fear had been wielded as effectively as any sword, reshaping the order and altering the trajectory of European history in a single, meticulously planned night. The arrest of the Templars became a turning point, a moment when legend and reality collided in stark relief. Publicly, the king and his ministers justified the action with accusations of heresy, corruption, and treachery, framing the narrative for the broader population. Privately, families who had long influenced the order understood that the events had been an opportunity, a way to remove obstacles and secure strategic advantage. Knights who had once been celebrated for their bravery became cautionary figures, reminders of the dangers of loyalty untempered by awareness of hidden currents. And yet, the courage they had shown in life and in battle continued to echo, creating a haunting juxtaposition of heroism and manipulation, devotion and betrayal. Even after the arrests, the implications rippled across Europe. Other orders observed carefully, adjusting allegiances and strategies, wary of falling victim to similar machinations. Families who had influenced the Templars now extended their reach, guiding successor orders and ensuring that control over the knights, and through them over territories, wealth, and influence, remained secure. History remembers the fall of the Templars as a dramatic episode of faith, power, and tragedy. Yet beneath the surface, it was also a testament to the enduring influence of those who had learned to operate invisibly, to shape events without ever appearing on the battlefield, and to manipulate human ambition with precision that rivaled the tactics of war itself. The night left scars not only on the individuals captured but on the very idea of loyalty and honor. Knights who survived would carry the memory of betrayal for the rest of their lives, a lingering shadow over their devotion and courage. Families who orchestrated the fall understood the necessity of fear, but also the fragility of influence, reminding themselves that control required constant vigilance, patience, and adaptability. The Templars' fall was not merely a historical event. It was a lesson in the power of subtlety, the danger of over-reliance on faith alone, and the enduring importance of unseen hands in shaping history. And so, as the city of Paris settled back into an uneasy calm, the torches extinguished, and silence reclaimed the streets, the consequences of that night lingered. Knights were imprisoned, wealth was seized, and the intricate web of influence that had sustained the Templars was altered forever. Yet the families who had orchestrated events remained largely unseen, their presence felt in outcomes, in shifts of power, in the reallocation of influence, but rarely acknowledged in the annals of history. They had demonstrated, with chilling precision, that even the most devoted, the most courageous, and the most revered could be brought to heel when ambition, strategy, and secrecy combined in the hands of those who understood the subtle art of invisible control. Amidst the ashes of shattered allegiances and the hushed whispers of betrayal, there existed another layer of the Templars' legacy, one that had always been veiled from the eyes of the common world: knowledge. Not just the knowledge of tactics or the strategic accumulation of wealth, but forbidden texts, cryptic manuscripts, and ancient wisdom that had been carefully preserved and guarded across generations. Families who influenced the knights understood that knowledge could be as powerful as any sword, perhaps more so, for it could direct action, shape destiny, and endure long after flesh and blood had passed into history. While kings seized treasuries and executed commanders, they often overlooked the quiet repositories of power, the written word, the hidden codices, and the knowledge that traveled in secrecy from one generation to the next. These manuscripts were not mere chronicles or mundane records of transactions. They were repositories of ideas that had been carefully encoded to conceal their full meaning. Symbols, numerical patterns, allegories, and esoteric languages were woven into texts, ensuring that only those trained in the interpretation could unlock their secrets. Knights themselves often encountered these texts, sometimes recognizing their importance, sometimes dismissing them as curiosities. Yet the families who had guided the Templars understood their potential. Knowledge could shape battle outcomes, reveal hidden loyalties, or even serve as leverage in negotiations. In essence, the manuscripts were weapons of strategy, intellect, and foresight, carefully guarded so that the uninitiated could neither exploit nor destroy them. Access to these manuscripts was tightly controlled. Hidden chambers, secret libraries, and private archives within fortresses housed volumes that chronicled not just history but power, alliances, debts, promises, and strategic plans encoded for future generations. Only the trusted few could enter these sanctuaries, often under oath of secrecy, bound by the threat of social, spiritual, or even physical consequences should they betray confidence. The families who orchestrated the flow of the Templars' influence used this knowledge as a subtle means of control. Knights were encouraged to act with courage and independence, but always within the framework subtly dictated by these texts. Every victory, every negotiation, every shift in allegiance could be influenced by guidance hidden within the ink of these sacred and secret volumes. The manuscripts themselves were often layered with complexity that challenged even the most learned scholars. Allegories intertwined with mathematical sequences, maps embedded with symbols, prayers that concealed strategic instructions, and historical accounts that contained hidden references to alliances, loyalties, and undisclosed agreements. These texts were both practical and mystical, blending the tangible with the symbolic. The families understood that to protect knowledge was to protect power, and that those who controlled its interpretation could influence the course of events far beyond immediate conflict. Knights might wield swords with courage, but families wielded knowledge with a patience and subtlety that often proved decisive. Even the most mundane-seeming documents could carry extraordinary weight. A ledger recording the distribution of supplies, when viewed in isolation, might appear trivial, yet cross-referenced with coded symbols, it revealed patterns of strategy, allegiance, and influence. Correspondence between minor knights, when properly interpreted, could disclose intentions, rivalries, and potential disruptions. Families who had guided the Templars cultivated both the collection and interpretation of information, ensuring that knowledge served not only to protect the order but also to secure advantage for those aligned with their vision. Information was power, and the control of it was an invisible sword, sharper than any blade on the battlefield. Some of these texts were rumored to contain knowledge older than the Templars themselves, hints of civilizations lost to time, fragments of philosophy and theology, or insights into human behavior and governance that transcended centuries. It was whispered that certain manuscripts included warnings, prophecies, or revelations that could disrupt kingdoms if misused, which is why they were guarded so jealously. Patrons and families understood that the dissemination of such knowledge could empower or destroy, and they managed it with a careful hand, allowing only those whose loyalty and discretion were assured to glimpse the truths contained within. In this way, the Templars were both protectors of the sacred and unwitting participants in a network of influence built upon secrets. The emotional and psychological impact of guarding such knowledge was immense. Knights entrusted with these manuscripts carried a burden beyond that of any battlefield. The responsibility of preserving secrets, interpreting allegories correctly, and acting in accordance with hidden guidance could weigh heavily, particularly when survival or moral dilemmas were at stake. Families who orchestrated this network understood that the human element was crucial. Knowledge alone could not ensure loyalty or compliance. It required the careful management of individuals, their fears, their ambitions, and their devotion. By embedding guidance within texts, they provided both instruction and subtle influence, shaping action without appearing to command it. Knowledge also served as a bridge between generations, a continuity that extended influence far beyond any single knight, commander, or patron. Manuscripts preserved alliances, strategies, and warnings that could be interpreted decades or even centuries later, ensuring that the family's vision endured even as individuals passed away. The orders themselves, though publicly independent, became vessels through which this accumulated wisdom flowed, guiding decisions and shaping the destiny of knights who might never suspect the extent of the invisible hand directing their paths. In effect, the manuscripts transformed the ephemeral courage of men into a legacy of enduring influence, linking human ambition across time. Rivalries, too, were influenced by knowledge. Families who controlled the manuscripts could manipulate perceptions, influence decisions, and provoke conflict or cooperation as it suited their long-term goals. The mere presence of a document, a hidden reference, or a subtle interpretation could shift alliances, redirect campaigns, or reconfigure power structures. Knights believed in divine inspiration and personal judgment, yet their choices were often subtly shaped by the concealed wisdom entrusted to them by the invisible architects of history. Knowledge became both shield and weapon, safeguarding influence while extending it across continents. Even in the chaos following the arrests of the Templars, the manuscripts remained a cornerstone of power. While treasuries were seized and knights imprisoned, the hidden texts survived, carefully concealed by those loyal to the families who had orchestrated events from the shadows. These manuscripts ensured that influence persisted, even in the absence of immediate actors. New alliances could be formed, instructions could be interpreted for the next generation, and strategic vision could be maintained despite disruption. Knowledge proved more enduring than gold, more resilient than armies, and infinitely more subtle than open displays of power. In the end, the forbidden manuscripts and secret texts of the Templars reveal a truth about history often overlooked, that the most enduring influence is rarely wielded with overt force. It is preserved in ink, encoded in allegory, and safeguarded by loyalty, shaping events from behind the veil of perception. The families who orchestrated the knights' actions understood this, blending strategy, patience, and foresight to guide outcomes that appeared natural to the outside world. Courage, devotion, and heroism were celebrated, but the invisible power of knowledge quietly dictated direction, determined alliances, and ensured that the ambitions of a select few resonated across generations. The manuscripts were silent witnesses, guardians of secrets, and instruments of influence, preserving a legacy that, while hidden from the eyes of the public, shaped history in ways as profound as any battlefield victory. The influence of the Templars and the families who guided them did not end at the shores of France or the battlements of Jerusalem. It stretched across the Mediterranean, weaving through the bustling ports of Italy, the fortified cities of Spain, and the distant lands of the Levant. These were regions of immense strategic importance, where commerce, politics, and religion intersected in a delicate balance. Families who understood the interplay of power realized that controlling the knights was only part of the equation. To truly extend their influence, they had to master the networks of trade, diplomacy, and allegiance that spanned the entire Mediterranean. The knights became more than soldiers; they became agents within a vast web of unseen authority, their actions guided not solely by faith, but by the imperatives of families whose vision extended across oceans and decades. In the ports of Venice and Genoa, where ships loaded with goods, gold, and information arrived daily, families positioned trusted agents to monitor and guide the flow of wealth. Trade was a lifeline both for armies and for political influence. The Templars, with their extensive network of fortresses and commanderies, became critical intermediaries in the movement of goods and information. Families understood that controlling the knights allowed them to shape economic currents as subtly as they shaped military campaigns. A fleet of ships could be diverted to favor a particular ally, a convoy protected to secure loyalty, or resources withheld to enforce compliance. Knights acted with valor, but they also became instruments of commerce and diplomacy, extending the reach of influence far beyond the battlefield. In Spain, where reconquest and religious fervor intersected, families saw opportunity in both conflict and negotiation. Knights stationed in frontier regions often served as mediators, defenders, and enforcers, yet their assignments were carefully influenced by patrons who understood the balance of power. A particular fortress might be reinforced not merely for defense, but to project authority over rival factions. A negotiation with local rulers might be encouraged, not merely to secure peace, but to solidify allegiance to families whose networks reached deep into Europe. Even the perception of loyalty could be manipulated, ensuring that knights acted in ways that aligned with broader strategies while maintaining the appearance of autonomy. In every encounter, every battle, every council, the invisible hand of guidance was present, subtle yet decisive. The Levant presented an even more complex landscape. Crusader states were fragile, vulnerable to attack, and dependent on the flow of supplies and reinforcements from Europe. Families who had long cultivated influence over the Templars understood that control over these territories required careful orchestration. Strategic fortresses, garrisons, and trade posts were monitored to ensure alignment with long-term objectives. Knights were deployed in ways that reinforced alliances, projected authority, and maintained the balance of power. Even religious obligations, pilgrimages, and holy sites were leveraged as tools of influence, ensuring that spiritual devotion served broader strategic goals. The Templars became a bridge, connecting European ambition with the realities of distant territories, guided by patrons whose visions spanned continents. Diplomacy was another instrument of influence. Families understood that control was not achieved solely through force. Negotiation, persuasion, and subtle manipulation were equally vital. Knights, with their reputation for honor and faith, were ideal agents for these delicate tasks. They could mediate disputes, convey messages, or enforce agreements, all while maintaining the perception of impartiality. Patrons guided them carefully, choosing assignments and missions that would reinforce networks of loyalty, destabilize rivals, or secure strategic advantage. Each interaction, whether in a royal court or a merchant hall, was part of a broader plan, with outcomes anticipated and influenced by those who understood both human nature and the long arc of strategy. The Mediterranean itself became a living map of influence. Ports, fortresses, and trade routes were carefully considered, each a node in a network extending from France to the Holy Land and back again. Knights' movements, the timing of campaigns, and the distribution of resources were all calibrated to align with the long-term vision of families whose foresight extended generations ahead. Information flowed silently, intelligence networks monitored rivals and allies alike, and strategic interventions could be made without ever appearing to command or coerce. The Mediterranean was not just a region. It was a stage on which the invisible currents of power played out, shaping events in ways that few could perceive. Even in the midst of conflict, families ensured that influence persisted. A siege could be prolonged or shortened to favor particular objectives, reinforcements allocated to reinforce alliances, and resources deployed to secure compliance. Knights, devoted to God and committed to their orders, often acted without understanding the larger strategic calculus, yet their actions were precisely what patrons intended. Every fortress held, every city captured, and every treaty negotiated contributed to a carefully designed landscape of power. The Templars' presence across the Mediterranean was both practical and symbolic, a reminder that the reach of influence extended far beyond individual acts of courage. The personal stakes for knights and patrons alike were profound. Knights carried the weight of honor, faith, and duty, unaware that their actions were channels through which the ambitions of families flowed. Patrons, in turn, balanced the human cost of campaigns against the imperatives of strategy, understanding that loyalty and courage were precious yet fragile resources. Decisions were never taken lightly. A single misstep, a failed negotiation, a delayed shipment, a misjudged alliance, could reverberate across kingdoms, altering the balance of power in unpredictable ways. Yet for those skilled in the subtle art of influence, even chaos could be harnessed, and uncertainty transformed into opportunity. Information and secrecy were critical. Messages moved swiftly between ports, fortresses, and courts, often encrypted, coded, or conveyed through trusted intermediaries. Patrons monitored not only the Templars' actions but also the responses of rivals, allies, and monarchs, adjusting strategies as circumstances evolved. Knights acted as both executors and observers, their reports shaping decisions far beyond the battlefield. In this way, influence extended across time and space, a network that transformed the Mediterranean into a theater of both visible and invisible power. The consequences of this orchestration were profound. Entire regions, from Italian city-states to Crusader fortresses, were shaped not solely by military might, but by the invisible hands guiding the knights and their patrons. The balance of trade, the distribution of resources, and the alliances forged through diplomacy reflected the enduring influence of families who understood the subtleties of control. Knights, acting with valor and devotion, became instruments in a network that extended far beyond their perception, bridging continents and shaping history in ways both subtle and decisive. Even centuries later, the traces of this influence can be discerned in the patterns of alliances, trade routes, and fortresses that the Mediterranean landscape. The Templars' presence, guided by hidden patrons, left an imprint not only in history books but in the very fabric of the regions they touched. Their courage and devotion were genuine, yet their effectiveness was amplified by the careful orchestration of families who understood that influence, patience, and strategy could shape events more profoundly than any army. The Mediterranean was their stage, the knights their instruments, and history itself their canvas. The pursuit of power among the hidden families that influenced the knights extended far beyond strategy, wealth, or political maneuvering. They understood that control could also be exercised through the subtler forces of belief, perception, and the unseen laws of the cosmos. Mysticism, astrology, and alchemy became tools as vital as armies, fortresses, or gold. In an age when the boundaries between science, faith, and magic were fluid, these families recognized that symbols, celestial events, and the transmutation of matter could shape human behavior, reinforce loyalty, and manipulate outcomes in ways that few could detect. Knights, steeped in piety and bound by oaths, often viewed such practices with reverence or curiosity, unaware that their actions were being guided by patrons who understood the profound influence of the esoteric. In secluded chambers and hidden study halls, advisors skilled in celestial observation and arcane theory calculated the movements of stars and planets. They interpreted these patterns not merely as divination but as signals to influence timing, strategy, and morale. Families who controlled the knights often used astrology to determine when campaigns should begin, when alliances should be proposed, and even when crucial battles should be fought. Knights were told that the alignment of the heavens reflected divine favor, yet the true guidance lay in calculations and foresight, a subtle orchestration ensuring that human courage was directed at moments when success was most likely. The celestial clock became a silent partner in the strategies of those who understood both the heavens and the human heart. Alchemy, too, was more than a pursuit of gold. It was a metaphor and a method, a means of transforming not just matter, but influence itself. Laboratories hidden in fortified castles and manor houses produced not only experimental substances, but also the symbols and rituals that reinforced the patron's authority. Transmutation became a language. The manipulation of substances mirrored the manipulation of people, wealth, and events. Knights, often exposed to alchemical symbols and teachings, were subtly conditioned to interpret events, victories, and failures through lenses that reinforced loyalty and obedience. Faith and reason became intertwined with hidden instruction, shaping perception as much as guiding action. In this way, even the material world became a canvas for power. Mysticism, intertwined with both astrology and alchemy, added an additional layer of influence. Sacred geometry, ritual observances, and symbolic gestures were carefully embedded into the culture of the knights. Ceremonies, seemingly religious in nature, often contained hidden messages or subtle manipulations intended to instill loyalty and focus. A prayer recited at dawn, a candle lit in a particular sequence, a procession timed to celestial events, all reinforced the patron's objectives while maintaining the appearance of spiritual devotion. The knights believed they were guided by divine will, yet their faith was, in many ways, harmonized with the ambitions and foresight of families who had mastered the subtle art of unseen control. The psychological impact of these practices was profound. Knights, confronted with omens, portents, and mystical rituals, often internalized these signs as directives from God or as moral guidance. Their courage, judgment, and loyalty were strengthened, yet they were operating within an invisible framework designed to ensure compliance and strategic alignment. Fear, awe, and reverence became instruments of subtle influence. The families who employed these methods understood human nature intimately. Belief could be molded, perception guided, and behavior subtly directed through the careful orchestration of ritual, symbolism, and celestial timing. Even the most practical aspects of military campaigns were influenced by esoteric knowledge. Astrology informed the timing of marches, sieges, and reinforcements. Mystical readings could determine when to engage or retreat, when to send envoys or delay negotiations. Alchemical preparations, potions, salves, and substances were sometimes used to bolster morale, heal the wounded, or create the appearance of supernatural protection. Knights believed these measures reflected divine favor or providence, yet the families had carefully orchestrated them to maximize confidence, maintain cohesion, and ensure obedience. Faith and mysticism became tools of strategy, subtly entwined with material and military planning. Information, intelligence, and secrecy were reinforced through esoteric methods as well. Codes embedded in manuscripts, hidden in alchemical diagrams or astrological charts, allowed families to transmit instructions across distances without detection. A star chart might encode troop movements, a ritual might signal an alliance, or an alchemical symbol might indicate a hidden cache of resources. The knights' commitment to secrecy and ritual ensured that the messages were preserved and interpreted as intended. Knowledge, perception, and action were therefore inseparable, each element reinforcing the other under the subtle guidance of those who understood both the mystical and practical dimensions of influence. The influence of these methods was also intergenerational. Families carefully passed down the understanding of astrology, alchemy, and mysticism alongside strategic and political knowledge. Heirs were trained not only in martial skill and diplomacy but also in the subtle arts of observation, calculation, and ritual. Knights themselves, although rarely fully aware of the broader implications, often carried forward traditions that reinforced patterns of loyalty, obedience, and strategic effectiveness. In this way, the power of the patrons endured, embedded in both human behavior and the symbolic frameworks that guided it. Influence became a living system, extending across generations and continents, woven into the very culture of the knights. The stakes of such influence were immense. A miscalculated ritual, an improperly interpreted celestial alignment, or a misused symbol could destabilize campaigns, erode trust, or weaken cohesion. Families understood that human error could disrupt even the most carefully designed strategies. Therefore, patience, foresight, and continuous observation were essential. Advisors skilled in the mystical arts operated in parallel with commanders, ensuring that both perception and action were aligned with the broader objectives. Success was rarely left to chance. It was orchestrated through a combination of knowledge, timing, and psychological influence, demonstrating the subtle genius of those who operated behind the visible drama of faith and warfare. The ethical dimensions of this manipulation were complex. Families relied on human devotion, courage, and morality, yet they harnessed these qualities to serve objectives that often remained hidden. Knights believed themselves to be acting in service to God, while in truth their actions also served the long-term strategic vision of unseen patrons. Fear, reverence, and awe became both motivators and instruments, aligning human behavior with plans that could span decades. The intersection of faith, ambition, and manipulation created a tension that added both depth and subtle drama to every campaign, every decision, and every ritual. Ultimately, the use of mysticism, astrology, and alchemy allowed the families to extend their influence in ways that were invisible, enduring, and profound. Knights were strengthened, decisions guided, and outcomes shaped, often without anyone outside the inner circle ever realizing how carefully the currents of power had been managed. Courage, devotion, and strategy were intertwined with ritual and symbolism, producing a system in which faith and influence were inseparable. The knights became not only warriors of God but instruments of a design orchestrated across generations, blending the mystical with the practical in a symphony of subtle control. Through these methods, the families demonstrated a truth that would resonate across centuries: that the most enduring power is often invisible, subtle, and psychological, exercised not through brute force alone, but through perception, belief, and the careful orchestration of human experience. Knights, celebrated for their courage and piety, were guided by forces unseen, influenced by knowledge both mystical and practical, and positioned to act in ways that served ambitions far greater than themselves. In this blending of faith, science, and strategy, the hidden patrons mastered a form of control that was as enduring as it was undetectable, shaping the course of history through the subtle alchemy of human behavior. Beyond the battlefields and fortresses, the families who guided the knights exercised their influence in realms where power was measured not by swords or banners but by subtle authority: the courts of kings, the councils of bishops, and even the chambers of the papacy itself. These families understood that military might alone could not secure lasting control. Influence had to be cultivated in whispers, negotiations, and the delicate manipulation of perception. Knights could fight and win, but empires were shaped, preserved, and expanded through the invisible guidance of those who knew when to push, when to yield, and when to remain unseen. Through careful orchestration, these families held sway over rulers, shaped political decisions, and ensured that the world moved in directions favorable to their vision. At the courts of Europe, influence often appeared as courtesy and counsel, yet beneath the surface it was strategy executed with precision. Advisors placed by these families guided kings in their decisions, offering recommendations that seemed natural or prudent, but were in fact carefully aligned with long-term goals. Marriages were proposed and arranged not solely for love or alliance, but for the consolidation of power across multiple territories. Laws were influenced, policies shaped, and diplomacy conducted in ways that reinforced the hidden network of control. Monarchs often believed they were acting independently, yet each decision, each treaty, each act of governance could be traced to the subtle nudges of families whose foresight spanned generations. The influence extended to the papacy, where spiritual authority could validate, challenge, or redirect worldly power. Families who understood the mechanisms of faith and politics placed loyal agents in positions that could sway papal opinion or manipulate ecclesiastical priorities. Decisions about funding crusades, endorsing orders, or adjudicating disputes were often guided by correspondence and counsel originating from these hidden patrons. Knights, bound by oath and devotion, were themselves indirectly influenced by these ecclesiastical maneuvers. A papal endorsement, a decree, or even a subtle recommendation could alter the trajectory of campaigns, secure strategic alliances, or shift the balance of power without a single sword being drawn. Spiritual authority became a tool, wielded with care, precision, and subtlety. The family's ability to navigate rivalries and alliances was equally remarkable. European courts were volatile, filled with ambition, envy, and ambition-driven intrigue. One misstep, a poorly timed endorsement, a neglected gift, a misinterpreted alliance, could have catastrophic consequences. Yet the families who guided the knights understood these dynamics intuitively. They positioned loyal intermediaries, cultivated networks of obligation, and maintained channels of intelligence to anticipate shifts in loyalty, threats to power, and opportunities to consolidate influence. Knights, while revered for their courage, were often unknowingly acting within this intricate framework, their valor channeled toward outcomes preordained by strategy rather than chance. Information, secrecy, and timing were critical components of control. Families monitored events across Europe, ensuring that messages, decrees, and alliances arrived at the optimal moment. Knights might be dispatched to enforce treaties or protect envoys, yet the precise timing and choice of assignment were influenced by these invisible forces. Even victories and defeats on the battlefield were leveraged to influence political perception, redirect attention, and manipulate rivalries. The orchestration was meticulous, designed to secure advantage while preserving the appearance of independence, competence, and divine favor. Influence operated as a subtle current, shaping the course of kingdoms, orders, and campaigns without overt confrontation. The psychological dimension of this control was profound. Kings and rulers were human, subject to fear, ambition, and desire. The families who guided them understood this intimately. They cultivated loyalty through flattery, obligation, and shared interest, while simultaneously instilling caution and awareness of potential rivals. Advice was offered as counsel, alliances framed as necessity, and threats conveyed through subtle means. Monarchs often believed they were exercising their own judgment, yet their choices were shaped by unseen hands, guided by the calculated foresight of those who understood both human nature and the mechanics of long-term strategy. Influence was exercised not through coercion alone but through the careful management of perception and incentive. Political events often unfolded as dramas in which every player was carefully positioned. Marriages, wars, treaties, and disputes were guided not only by immediate concerns, but by long-term considerations that could extend generations. A king might marry his daughter to a neighboring prince, believing it a prudent choice, yet the hidden motive might be to secure a line of succession, create a network of alliances, or neutralize a rival. Knights enforcing or negotiating on behalf of such arrangements were unaware that their actions were part of a broader, multi-generational plan. Every move was anticipated, every consequence accounted for, creating a web of influence that extended invisibly through time and space. The management of rival families was equally sophisticated. Competition was inevitable, yet it could be neutralized without open conflict through diplomacy, selective support, and manipulation of perception. By fostering loyalty among some while subtly undermining others, the families maintained a balance that allowed them to consolidate influence over the knights, rulers, and territories simultaneously. Even apparent chaos could be transformed into opportunity. Rebellions, disputes, or crises were often exploited to strengthen the patron's position. The ability to control outcomes without revealing the orchestration was the hallmark of their subtle genius. Financial power was another instrument of influence. Wealth allowed the families to secure loyalty, fund campaigns, and reward compliance, yet it was deployed strategically. Loans, gifts, and endowments were offered not merely as generosity but as leverage. Knights could be funded, fortresses reinforced, and diplomatic missions financed in ways that ensured alignment with the hidden patron's objectives. Even kingdoms were influenced through the careful distribution of resources, subtly encouraging loyalty, dependence, and strategic cooperation. Control over wealth reinforced political influence, creating a multi-layered system in which power was exercised invisibly, yet decisively. The emotional stakes of these maneuvers were immense. Monarchs, knights, and intermediaries were bound by loyalty, fear, ambition, and devotion, often unaware that their decisions were guided by invisible hands. Mistakes could be disastrous. Misjudged loyalties or misinterpreted guidance could threaten campaigns, alliances, or territories. Yet the families who orchestrated these networks anticipated such challenges, embedding redundancy, cultivating alternative channels of influence, and maintaining oversight that extended across generations. Influence became a living system, dynamic and resilient, capable of shaping the destiny of Europe without overt displays of force. By the time the knights had achieved prominence, the families who guided them had secured influence that extended across both military and political spheres. They had shaped rulers, influenced papal decisions, and directed alliances, all while maintaining the appearance of ordinary participation. Knights were instruments, battles were theaters, and kingdoms became canvases upon which the unseen architects painted their designs. Valor, loyalty, and faith were essential, yet they operated within a framework shaped by strategy, foresight, and subtle manipulation. The combination of spiritual guidance, political influence, and strategic orchestration created a system of enduring power that few could perceive, yet whose effects were undeniable. Even centuries later, The consequences of this influence are visible in the patterns of alliances, the rise and fall of dynasties, and the structures of authority across Europe. Monarchs may appear autonomous in historical records, yet many decisions reflect the invisible orchestration of families whose foresight extended generations before and after their lifetimes. Knights, celebrated for courage and devotion, were guided not only by faith but by the subtle manipulations of those who understood that true power is exercised quietly, invisibly, and with extraordinary patience. The intertwining of military, spiritual, and political influence created a legacy that endures, a testament to the subtle genius of families who understood that empires are often guided as much by whisper and counsel as by sword and battle. The life of a knight was one of paradox. Devotion to God, courage on the battlefield, and unwavering loyalty to an order. Yet often, these virtues became tools in a grand design orchestrated by families whose ambitions stretched far beyond the reach of the individual. Knights believed themselves to be autonomous, guided by honor, faith, and moral duty. They swore oaths of loyalty, defended the weak, and pursued glory in the name of divine justice. Yet behind every assignment, every campaign, and every strategic maneuver lurked the subtle hand of patrons who understood that men of courage could be instruments of influence, their valor and obedience harnessed to serve objectives often hidden from view. The tension between personal integrity and imposed expectation became a constant undercurrent in the lives of those who carried swords and banners into battle. In the quiet moments between campaigns, knights reflected on their purpose. They had witnessed cities fall, battles won or lost, and companions perish, yet they rarely understood the full scope of forces shaping their actions. Every order they followed, every mission they executed, had been filtered through networks of loyalty, counsel, and influence designed by families who operated in the shadows. To the knights, victory was an achievement of courage and faith. To the patrons, it was a calculated outcome, part of a broader strategy that consolidated power, preserved influence, and extended the reach of their lineage. The knights were simultaneously heroes and instruments, their human experience intertwined with a design they could never fully perceive. The psychological toll of this dual existence was immense. Knights were trained to act decisively, to follow orders, and to endure hardships without question. Yet within their hearts, doubts occasionally surfaced. They questioned whether their loyalty was fully theirs, whether decisions made in moments of moral ambiguity were truly aligned with divine will, or whether they were acting in accordance with the unseen agendas of powerful families. Moments of hesitation, fear, or conscience became opportunities for patrons to exert subtle guidance, ensuring that even hesitation was absorbed into the broader strategy. Human nature, in all its complexity, was as much a battlefield as the plains and fortresses where they fought. The moral complexity of their roles intensified during campaigns. Knights often faced situations where the righteous and the strategic were not aligned. A decision to protect one village over another, to favor an ally in negotiations, or to prioritize reinforcements could carry profound ethical consequences. The patrons who orchestrated these assignments understood the stakes, balancing human morality against strategic necessity. Knights were guided to make choices that reinforced the patron's vision, often while believing they were acting solely in service to God or their order. Valor and morality became intertwined with obligation and manipulation, creating an internal struggle that few outside the inner circle could comprehend. Loyalty, one of the knightly virtues most celebrated in chronicles, became a delicate and complex instrument of control. Knights were often bound by dual allegiances, one to their order and another unseen, to the families whose influence guided assignments and campaigns. The tension between personal honor and external direction created a landscape of quiet conflict. A knight might hesitate when an order of battle conflicted with his sense of justice, yet subtle cues, advice from trusted mentors, symbols, or strategically delivered intelligence, would realign him with the patron's objectives. This constant negotiation of loyalty, perception, and conscience was as much a test of character as any sword fight. The patron's influence extended into the very organization of orders. Assignments, promotions, and responsibilities were carefully calibrated to ensure that the most influential knights aligned with the family's objectives. Leadership positions were often secured by those whose judgment and loyalty had been subtly shaped from the beginning. Knights demonstrating exceptional courage or initiative were sometimes steered into roles where their influence could be harnessed effectively. Conversely, those whose actions suggested potential independence or unpredictability might be assigned to less critical positions, subtly marginalized while maintaining the appearance of merit-based reward. The orchestration was meticulous, balancing human skill with strategic foresight to ensure that every act, every campaign, and every decision furthered the broader design. Human ambition added another layer of complexity. Many knights carried personal desires for fame, power, or recognition. Patrons understood how to channel these ambitions to serve strategic ends. A young knight seeking glory might be assigned to a campaign designed to secure political advantage, a promotion, or a symbolic victory that reinforced the family's influence. His personal drive became aligned with the unseen objectives, transforming desire into a tool of orchestration. This manipulation of ambition, often imperceptible, allowed families to extend their reach across campaigns, alliances, and territories without direct intervention, turning individual aspiration into collective strategy. Yet the human element also introduced unpredictability. Courage, conscience, and emotion could disrupt even the most carefully laid plans. Knights might act contrary to expectation, disobey orders in moments of moral clarity, or make decisions motivated by personal loyalty rather than calculated obedience. Patrons accounted for this by embedding redundancy, cultivating multiple channels of influence, and creating networks that could absorb deviation without compromising the broader strategy. The orchestration of knights' actions was not absolute. It relied on understanding, anticipating, and subtly guiding human behavior across both battlefields and courts. The personal sacrifices demanded of knights were immense. They endured harsh climates, brutal battles, and the constant threat of death. Yet their labor served not only God and order, but also invisible agendas whose full scope they could never comprehend. The emotional and physical toll of such service was compounded by the awareness, whether conscious or not, that their autonomy was constrained, their victories partly engineered, and their failures often absorbed into a larger narrative controlled by others. Courage, loyalty, and sacrifice were real, yet inseparable from manipulation, creating a profound tension between selfhood and duty. Despite these pressures, knights often emerged as remarkable individuals, blending personal skill, courage, and devotion with the guidance imparted by patrons. The duality of their roles, both heroes and instruments, produced profound resilience. They acted decisively, inspired loyalty in others, and carried the weight of moral and strategic responsibility, often unaware that their actions were subtly directed toward larger objectives. Their achievements were celebrated, their bravery immortalized, yet the invisible networks that had shaped their path remained hidden, a silent testament to the genius of the patrons who orchestrated the interplay of human ambition, morality, and courage. The human drama inherent in this orchestration was immense. Knights formed bonds of friendship, mentorship, and rivalry, unaware that these relationships were also instruments of influence. Loyalty and trust were cultivated, tested, and leveraged, ensuring that interpersonal dynamics reinforced strategic objectives. Betrayal, tension, and conflict within orders were often anticipated, subtly guided, or used as tools to align behavior with broader plans. The knights' humanity, their fears, hopes, attachments, and rivalries, was itself a resource, shaped by the careful insight of those who understood the delicate calculus of influence and obedience. Ultimately, the life of a knight was both heroic and tragic. Heroic in the courage displayed, the devotion endured, and the victories achieved. Tragic in the manipulation, the subtle orchestration, and the sacrifices demanded by agendas beyond their comprehension. Families who guided them recognized that human loyalty, ambition, and courage were instruments to be refined, directed, and sometimes tested, ensuring that individual action aligned with multi-generational objectives. Knights were simultaneously authors of their own stories and actors in a drama scripted by forces they could not fully perceive, their valor inseparable from the subtle art of influence that had shaped them from the beginning. Through this orchestration, the families secured not just immediate control, but enduring influence. Knights, while celebrated for courage and devotion, became vessels of legacy, shaping events in ways that reinforced long-term objectives. Campaigns, alliances, and victories reflected both individual bravery and the careful calibration of invisible patrons. The intersection of human emotion, ambition, morality, and obedience created a profound narrative, one in which the knights' stories were inseparable from the strategic vision that guided them. Even centuries later, the echoes of their courage and the shadows of their manipulation remain intertwined in the history of orders, kingdoms, and families that understood the subtle balance of loyalty, ambition, and influence. Among the most enduring legacies of the families who guided the knights were the treasures they protected, objects imbued with both material and symbolic power, often hidden from public view yet central to the orchestration of influence. These were not merely gold, jewels, or land. They were heirlooms, sacred relics, and coded artifacts whose value lay as much in the stories they carried as in the wealth they represented. Knights may have fought for honor, loyalty, or faith, but the ultimate stakes were often entwined with these treasures. They were symbols of continuity, legitimacy, and authority, carefully preserved and transmitted across generations to secure influence and reinforce the hidden structures of power. Some treasures were tangible reminders of divine favor. Relics of saints, fragments of holy sites, or consecrated artifacts held immense spiritual significance, capable of inspiring devotion, awe, and obedience among knights and followers alike. The families who protected these objects understood that spiritual authority could be leveraged to enforce loyalty. A relic presented at a strategic moment could galvanize troops, strengthen a commander's authority, or intimidate rivals. Its presence served as a bridge between faith and strategy, allowing the patrons to exert influence without overt confrontation. Knights, deeply reverent, often perceived such artifacts as signs of divine guidance, unaware that their reactions were anticipated and subtly guided by those who understood the intertwined power of belief and manipulation. Other treasures were repositories of knowledge. Manuscripts, maps, and codices encoded with history, strategy, and secret alliances were guarded as fiercely as any sword or fortress. These objects contained instructions, warnings, or prophecies that could influence decisions across kingdoms. Families ensured that access was restricted to trusted individuals, often knights themselves, who could act on this information in accordance with the patron's long-term objectives. The treasures became instruments of control, not merely symbols of wealth. Knowledge and power were inseparable, and the guardianship of these heirlooms allowed families to shape events with precision, subtly guiding the actions of men who believed themselves autonomous yet were, in reality, operating within a carefully orchestrated framework. The strategic significance of these treasures extended to political and military arenas. Fortified castles, hidden vaults, and secure chambers were designed to store and protect these valuable objects. Their locations were selected not only for security but for symbolic impact, situated where they could reinforce authority, control key territories, or project power to allies and rivals alike. Knights tasked with their protection became participants in a broader network of influence, their loyalty and judgment critical to ensuring that the treasures served their intended purpose. Even in the event of a siege, the presence of these objects could alter negotiations, reinforce morale, or shift the balance of power. The treasures were simultaneously practical, symbolic, and psychological instruments of authority. Many treasures carried encoded messages or instructions that only those trained in specific knowledge could interpret. Heraldic symbols, alchemical inscriptions, or cryptic diagrams were embedded within seemingly mundane objects, transforming heirlooms into tools of strategy. A chalice, a jeweled pendant, or a tapestry could convey information about alliances, military movements, or succession plans. Knights might handle these objects reverently, perceiving them as sacred or valuable, while their deeper purpose remained hidden from view. The families orchestrating these designs understood that perception was as important as reality. Belief in divine favor, sacred authority, or inherent legitimacy reinforced the obedience and loyalty needed to execute long-term plans. The emotional resonance of these treasures was profound. They represented continuity across generations, connecting the living to ancestors and the present to the past. Knights entrusted with their protection often felt a deep personal responsibility, understanding that their actions carried consequences far beyond immediate survival or honor. Families, in turn, recognized that emotional attachment to these objects was a powerful motivator, reinforcing loyalty and obedience. Courage and devotion were harnessed not through coercion alone but through reverence, pride, and the understanding that these treasures were part of a lineage, a story that demanded preservation and respect. The hidden value of these objects also lay in their capacity to consolidate influence. Control over a sacred relic, a strategic map, or a codex could elevate a family's authority, grant legitimacy to claims of land or title, or shift political allegiances. Rival houses might covet a particular artifact not only for its intrinsic worth but for the power it conferred. Knights assigned to protect such treasures were thus simultaneously guardians of material wealth, spiritual authority, and political leverage. Every action they took, every decision they made regarding the treasures, contributed to a broader design that spanned kingdoms and generations. The treasures were often mobile, moving strategically to avoid capture, consolidate power, or influence perception. Knights transported them between fortresses, monasteries, and royal courts, each relocation carefully planned to maximize symbolic impact and strategic advantage. A relic displayed at a crucial council could inspire faith or fear. A codex presented to a king could guide policy. A jeweled heirloom could cement alliances. Movement and placement were as much a part of the orchestration as the objects themselves, reflecting the sophisticated understanding families had of psychology, symbolism, and strategy. Some of these treasures became the focus of legends, myths, and speculation, their true value hidden beneath layers of narrative and secrecy. Tales of lost relics, hidden vaults, or cursed artifacts circulated widely, often obscuring the practical significance of the objects. Knights and scholars alike speculated on their spiritual or mystical powers, unaware that their deeper purpose was strategic, to guide loyalty, influence action, and preserve the continuity of power. By cloaking practical utility in myth and reverence, the families ensured that control could be maintained while protecting the treasures from both opportunists and enemies. Even after centuries, the significance of these heirlooms endured. Their protection ensured that influence could be transmitted across generations, even as individual knights, commanders, or rulers passed away. The treasures became symbols of the family's vision, repositories of knowledge, and instruments of authority that extended beyond the temporal reach of any single human life. The interplay of material wealth, sacred symbolism, and encoded information created a system of power that was at once subtle, enduring, and profoundly effective. Knights, motivated by honor and devotion, became vessels through which these treasures served their purpose, extending influence across time, space, and human perception. Ultimately, the hidden treasures of the Knights reveal a deeper truth about the orchestration of power in medieval Europe. That authority is rarely exercised solely through force, that loyalty is often guided by belief and symbolism, and that knowledge, reverence, and strategy are intertwined in ways that few perceive. The families who safeguarded these objects understood this instinctively, blending human ambition, faith, and material influence into a system that was resilient, subtle, and enduring. Knights, celebrated for their courage and piety, were simultaneously guardians of these treasures and unwitting participants in a network of influence that shaped kingdoms, orders, and the course of history itself. The treasures were more than gold or relics. They were instruments of legacy, tools of strategy, and symbols of a vision that transcended generations. Every guarded object, every hidden codex, and every sacred relic carried within it a story of influence, loyalty, and subtle orchestration. They were the quiet constants amid the chaos of war, the linchpins of authority that ensured families' control persisted through triumphs and tragedies alike. Knights, inspired by faith, devotion, and honor, became the human conduits for the power these treasures embodied. Their courage and dedication intertwined with the invisible currents of influence that flowed silently through the medieval world. Power, in the medieval world, was rarely absolute, and even the most influential families understood that threats could emerge from the shadows, cloaked in piety, ambition, or envy. Among the most potent tools for neutralizing rivals was the accusation of heresy, a weapon as subtle and devastating as any sword. It wielded fear, public shame, and divine authority simultaneously, allowing those who understood the currents of influence to reshape alliances, eliminate threats, and consolidate control without resorting to open conflict. Knights, while devoted to faith and sworn to uphold justice, often found themselves unwitting participants in a drama orchestrated by families whose ambitions were hidden, yet whose grasp extended into every corner of power. The use of heresy as a weapon required cunning and timing. A rumor whispered in the right court, a denunciation delivered to the Pope, or an accusation circulated among influential peers could irreversibly damage a knight, a rival family, or even a regional lord. The weight of religious authority magnified the impact. No secular army, no alliance of swords, could achieve what a well-timed accusation of heresy could accomplish. The mere suggestion that one had strayed from orthodoxy could isolate allies, provoke legal investigations, and invite imprisonment or execution. Families who controlled the knights understood this duality. Faith could inspire, but it could also intimidate, coerce, and manipulate with devastating precision. Accusations of heresy were rarely straightforward. They were embedded in layers of intrigue, half-truths, and careful exaggeration. A knight might be accused of secret allegiances, clandestine practices, or moral failings, all framed as deviations from divine law. The process was intentionally complex, relying on fear, uncertainty, and the perception of authority rather than evidence alone. Families orchestrating these accusations ensured that the social, political, and emotional consequences were maximized. Knights who might have been otherwise courageous and influential suddenly found themselves isolated, their loyalty questioned, their alliances strained. Even the perception of doubt could be more powerful than proof, turning faith into a mechanism of control. The psychological impact was profound. Knights accused of heresy faced not only the threat of physical punishment but the erosion of honor, reputation, and identity. Devotion, which had been a source of strength and pride, became a tool of vulnerability. Families wielding influence from behind the scenes understood the stakes. Fear could be directed, loyalty reinforced, and rivals neutralized without open battle. A knight's courage, skill, or devotion could be rendered ineffective if his reputation was tarnished, his alliances eroded, or his credibility undermined. The invisible hand of control operated most effectively when it manipulated perception, subtly guiding events to achieve strategic objectives. The consequences extended beyond the individual knight. Accusations of heresy could ripple through orders, families, and kingdoms, destabilizing networks of loyalty and influence. An entire order might be coerced into compliance, a rival house forced to acquiesce, or a regional lord compelled to realign allegiance. Families who had cultivated influence over knights anticipated these outcomes, orchestrating accusations to consolidate power, protect strategic interests, or eliminate threats. The resulting fear and uncertainty ensured that compliance became habitual, and that loyalty was reinforced through the understanding that deviation could carry catastrophic consequences. Timing was critical. Accusations were most effective when they coincided with moments of vulnerability, transition, or public attention. A knight returning from campaign, a commander newly appointed, or a family negotiating influence in court might be most susceptible to the weight of rumor and accusation. Families who understood human nature and political dynamics could orchestrate these moments with precision, ensuring that the threat of heresy amplified their objectives while minimizing exposure or backlash. Knights, devoted to faith and order, often accepted the accusations as divine or institutional judgment, unaware that they were part of a strategic design. Control over religious authorities was a key component. Families who influenced the knights often cultivated connections with the papacy, bishops, and clerical advisors, ensuring that accusations were taken seriously and enforced through the appropriate channels. Letters, testimonies, and reports were carefully managed to maintain the appearance of legitimacy, while subtly guiding the investigation toward predetermined outcomes. The combination of spiritual authority, legal procedure, and strategic influence allowed families to achieve objectives that were both effective and insulated from public scrutiny. The knights themselves were sometimes instruments in the process, enforcing compliance, delivering messages, or serving as witnesses, unaware of the broader orchestration behind the events. Even after accusations were levied, outcomes were meticulously guided. Trials, interrogations, and judgments were managed to serve strategic purposes. Some knights were neutralized through imprisonment, exile, or forced penance. Others were coerced into alignment with the family's objectives. In cases where execution was necessary, it was framed as moral or divine necessity, ensuring that fear and obedience were reinforced among both peers and successors. Families understood that public perception was as important as outcome. The demonstration of consequences served as both warning and reinforcement of invisible authority. The stakes were personal as well as strategic. Knights accused of heresy faced profound moral and emotional challenges. Their faith, honor, and self-perception were tested, often under extreme duress. The psychological toll reinforced the power of the hidden patrons, demonstrating that obedience, loyalty, and compliance could be secured through fear as much as through guidance. At the same time, families manipulating these accusations had to balance ruthlessness with prudence. Excessive brutality could provoke rebellion or backlash, while leniency might undermine authority. The orchestration required subtlety, foresight, and an acute understanding of human behavior. The ripple effects of accusations extended across generations. Families who eliminated rivals through heresy ensured that their influence would persist beyond immediate conflicts. Inherited authority, reinforced by fear and perception, created continuity of control. Knights who survived accusations or observed the consequences of others internalized the lesson. Loyalty and obedience were not merely virtues but requirements for survival. The invisible architecture of power was strengthened, extending through both individuals and institutions, creating a resilient network capable of guiding the actions of knights, rulers, and orders alike. Even centuries later, the strategic use of heresy remains a testament to the subtle genius of those who understood the interplay of fear, perception, and influence. Knights, while celebrated for courage and devotion, were often constrained, guided, and manipulated through the threat of moral and spiritual condemnation. Families who orchestrated these accusations ensured that compliance, alignment, and loyalty could be secured without open confrontation, achieving outcomes that were both efficient and enduring. The interplay of faith, ambition, and subtle coercion became a cornerstone of the invisible networks that shaped medieval Europe, illustrating the power of perception, belief, and psychological strategy alongside swords and fortresses. Ultimately, the strategic weaponization of heresy highlights the extraordinary sophistication of the families behind the knights. They recognized that human behavior, reputation, and moral authority could be directed with precision, influencing not only immediate outcomes but long-term patterns of loyalty and obedience. Knights, bound by faith and honor, became instruments in this system, their courage harnessed to objectives often invisible even to themselves. The orchestration of accusation, fear, and moral authority ensured that influence endured, extending across orders, kingdoms, and generations, shaping history in ways as subtle as they were decisive. Wealth, in the hands of those who understood its hidden power, became far more than a measure of prosperity. It became a tool, a lever, and in many ways, an invisible weapon. Families who influenced the knights recognized early that control over gold, credit, and trade could dictate the course of events across kingdoms, orders, and even the battlegrounds of the Crusades. Knights, celebrated for valor and loyalty, were often guided not only by oaths and faith, but by the movement of funds carefully orchestrated to direct their actions. Money, when applied with foresight and discretion, became a means to secure obedience, influence decisions, and shape outcomes in ways that swords and banners alone could not achieve. The financial networks developed by these families were intricate and sophisticated. Wealth was moved not merely to fund armies or maintain fortresses, but to manipulate alliances, cultivate loyalty, and exert subtle pressure on rivals. Loans were extended with conditions rarely written but universally understood, ensuring that indebtedness translated into influence. Gifts and endowments were strategically timed, creating obligations that could be called upon when circumstances demanded. Knights, often unaware of the broader orchestration, acted within a framework of economic influence that directed campaigns, secured territories, and reinforced networks of allegiance. Gold became a silent director of action, guiding human behavior through incentive, obligation, and necessity. Control over trade was equally critical. Ports, markets, and merchant guilds were monitored and manipulated to ensure that economic currents aligned with the family's objectives. Knights transported goods, protected convoys, or mediated disputes over resources, yet the allocation of wealth and commodities was carefully calibrated to maintain loyalty and strategic advantage. Favorable trade deals could secure the allegiance of powerful lords, while restrictions or embargoes could pressure rivals into compliance. Families understood that wealth created leverage in every arena, political, military, and social, and that economic influence could often achieve outcomes faster and more decisively than any campaign of conquest. Financial support was also a means of subtle reinforcement. Knights receiving funding for campaigns, fortifications, or expeditions often became indebted in ways invisible to observers. A shipment of armor or supplies, funded by a patron, could ensure compliance without overt instruction. A loan to a commander could align his priorities with the objectives of the families controlling the wealth. Even acts of personal generosity, a gift, a favor, or a symbolic donation, could reinforce bonds of loyalty. Money, reputation, and perception intertwined to create a network of influence in which knights acted as instruments, executing objectives while believing themselves guided by faith, duty, or honor. The orchestration of wealth required careful foresight. Families understood that overt displays of wealth could provoke envy, suspicion, or rebellion. Therefore, much of their economic influence was exercised quietly, through intermediaries, coded agreements, and subtle manipulations. Knights often saw the effects: reinforcements arriving, supplies delivered, alliances strengthened, without understanding the hand that had guided the process. The silent movement of wealth created conditions in which choices seemed natural, loyalty voluntary, and success inevitable. In this way, economic power was as potent as any weapon, its effects amplified by patience, discretion, and strategy. The psychological impact of financial control was profound. Knights and commanders, aware of their dependence on supplies, funding, and resources, were motivated to act in alignment with the objectives of those providing support. The invisible network of credit, obligation, and expectation ensured compliance without coercion. Families had learned that human ambition, when intertwined with material need, could be channeled to reinforce loyalty and obedience. Wealth became a form of psychological leverage, shaping decisions, directing action, and ensuring that human courage was exercised within parameters favorable to long-term objectives. Strategically, the movement of wealth extended beyond the immediate needs of campaigns. Families leveraged financial influence to consolidate power, eliminate rivals, and secure long-term advantages. A delayed payment could destabilize an opponent. A well-timed endowment could sway the loyalty of an entire contingent. Financial networks allowed families to orchestrate events at a distance, projecting authority across regions without deploying armies or issuing orders. Knights, while acting on orders and demonstrating valor, were simultaneously enmeshed in a web of economic influence that amplified the patron's reach across Europe and the Mediterranean. The integration of wealth, strategy, and human behavior created a system in which influence was enduring. Financial arrangements were structured to persist across generations, ensuring that families retained leverage over knights, orders, and territories long after the original actors had passed. Debts, obligations, and strategic investments became instruments of control, linking successive generations of knights and patrons into a continuous network of loyalty and influence. Even apparent failures could be converted into advantages, as the redistribution of resources reinforced new alliances, rewarded compliance, or punished deviation. Money, in this context, was not merely currency. It was continuity, leverage, and power in its most subtle and effective form. Trade routes, in particular, became vital arteries of influence. Control over maritime and overland commerce allowed families to direct the flow of goods, information, and even human capital. Knights assigned to protect convoys, secure ports, or mediate trade disputes were operating within a framework shaped by the invisible network of financial influence. Profitable routes were encouraged, rivals' access restricted, and the perception of authority reinforced. Economic control became a multiplier of military and political power, demonstrating that the families who guided the knights understood not only human behavior but the mechanisms by which wealth could extend influence beyond immediate visibility. The use of wealth also extended to cultural and symbolic influence. Funding of religious institutions, charitable donations, and the commissioning of monuments or manuscripts served multiple purposes, reinforcing loyalty, signaling authority, and consolidating prestige. Knights, who revered piety and tradition, often viewed these acts as expressions of faith or honor. Yet in reality, they were part of a broader strategy to cultivate dependence, admiration, and alignment with the family's long-term objectives. Financial power, therefore, became inseparable from social, political, and moral influence, shaping the perception of authority as effectively as it shaped the distribution of resources. Even crises such as famine, rebellion, or conflict were opportunities for financial orchestration. Families could deploy resources to stabilize loyal territories, reward compliance, or pressure dissenters into submission. Knights executing these tasks might believe they were fulfilling orders of duty or divine command, yet the allocation of wealth and resources often dictated the outcome before any battle was fought. Economic strategy, subtle and pervasive, became an essential complement to martial skill, ensuring that influence was sustained even in the face of human unpredictability. Ultimately, the financial networks crafted by these families reveal a fundamental truth about the orchestration of power: that influence is most enduring when it is subtle, pervasive, and inseparable from the daily actions of those it guides. Knights, celebrated for courage and devotion, were instruments through which wealth exerted its silent authority. Campaigns were funded, alliances reinforced, and loyalty secured, often without the awareness of those directly involved. Money, trade, and credit became threads in a web of influence that extended across kingdoms and generations, ensuring that families maintained control over the knights, orders, and regions in ways both invisible and enduring. Through these financial networks, the patrons achieved a form of control that was both subtle and omnipresent. Wealth moved quietly, decisions were influenced indirectly, and human ambition was harnessed without overt coercion. Knights acted as conduits for these objectives, their courage, loyalty, and skill amplified by the underlying economic architecture. In every campaign, negotiation, and assignment, the interplay of money, perception, and influence ensured that the patron's vision endured, leaving a legacy that shaped history as profoundly as any battle or conquest. The making of a knight was never solely a matter of strength, courage, or skill with the sword. It was, for those families who sought to control them, a process of careful shaping, education, and subtle indoctrination, designed to mold men who could be instruments of influence as well as warriors of faith. From the earliest stages of training, boys destined to become knights were observed, assessed, and guided, not just in the arts of combat but in the psychology of obedience, perception, and loyalty. Families understood that raw talent and piety alone were insufficient. True effectiveness required alignment with long-term strategic objectives, a discipline of mind and heart that ensured actions served purposes often invisible to the knights themselves. Education began with stories and examples, tales of valor and devotion carefully curated to emphasize loyalty, obedience, and the supremacy of the order above personal desire. These narratives highlighted not only courage in battle, but also the virtues of patience, discernment, and adherence to guidance from elders and mentors. Knights absorbed these lessons alongside martial training, internalizing the principle that true heroism was inseparable from fidelity to authority. Behind these lessons lay subtle indoctrination, an understanding that faith, courage, and honor were not only personal virtues but tools that could be directed toward the strategic objectives of the families who had guided the order for generations. Training was meticulous and immersive. Beyond the familiar exercises of horsemanship, swordsmanship, and tactical maneuvering, Young knights were introduced to protocols, symbols, and rituals designed to cultivate perception, judgment, and discretion. Observing ceremonies, participating in secret oaths, and decoding symbols were as much part of their development as martial skill. Each lesson reinforced the understanding that their actions existed within a larger framework, that obedience and discernment were both measured and expected, and that deviation, while sometimes excusable, could carry consequences both subtle and profound. Through repetition and guidance, knights learned to navigate a world in which visible and invisible forces intertwined. Mentorship played a critical role. Experienced knights, often loyal to both the order and the family's orchestrating influence, served as guides, advisors, and subtle instructors. They provided not only tactical instruction but insight into perception, negotiation, and psychological strategy. Young knights observed how decisions were made, how loyalty was cultivated, and how influence was subtly exerted over allies and rivals alike. These lessons were absorbed unconsciously, shaping judgment and character even as the knights pursued overt objectives of faith, honor, and battlefield glory. In effect, mentorship became a channel through which the philosophy and strategy of hidden patrons were transmitted, preparing knights to operate within a system of influence that extended far beyond their awareness. Moral education was intertwined with strategy. Knights were trained to distinguish between immediate impulses and long-term consequences, to balance courage with prudence, and to recognize the importance of loyalty not only to peers and orders, but to unseen networks of influence. Exercises in judgment, loyalty, and foresight were often presented as tests of faith or honor, reinforcing the principle that virtue and obedience were inseparable. In this way, the families shaping the knights ensured that human behavior, psychology, and morality became instruments aligned with broader objectives. Courage was not diminished, but it was refined, directed, and rendered effective in service to a vision extending beyond any single individual. Subtle indoctrination extended to perception and decision-making. Knights were encouraged to see patterns, interpret signs, and act with foresight, all within a framework designed by the patrons. Symbols, rituals, and teachings were layered with meaning, creating a language of instruction that guided judgment without overt command. For example, the timing of a ceremony or the placement of banners might communicate strategic priorities, alliances, or warnings. Knights trained to read these cues became not only warriors but instruments of guidance, capable of executing complex directives without explicit orders. The development of this perception was critical, enabling knights to navigate the interplay of faith, loyalty, and influence with skill and subtlety. The social and emotional dimensions of training were equally important. Knights were immersed in environments that cultivated loyalty, respect for hierarchy, and a sense of collective purpose. Bonds of camaraderie, mentorship, and shared experience reinforced adherence to expectations and created networks of mutual obligation. Families understood that human attachment, pride, and ambition could be harnessed as levers of influence. By embedding these elements into the training and education of knights, they ensured that loyalty became both a personal commitment and a structural necessity, seamlessly aligning individual action with broader objectives. Rituals and symbolism were deliberately intertwined with training. Knights participated in oaths, religious ceremonies, and ceremonial observances that reinforced the principles of obedience, loyalty, and strategic alignment. Symbols embedded in armor, banners, and heraldry communicated messages understood only by those initiated into the system, ensuring that instruction continued even in the absence of direct supervision. These practices reinforced awareness of both visible and invisible hierarchies, training knights to act not merely as soldiers, but as instruments in a network of influence that spanned orders, families, and kingdoms. The psychological conditioning extended to the anticipation of adversity. Knights were prepared to confront fear, uncertainty, and moral dilemmas, with guidance calibrated to ensure decisions aligned with strategic objectives. Exercises in resilience, loyalty, and judgment created a mindset in which courage was inseparable from discretion, and valor was inseparable from obedience. Families orchestrating these outcomes understood that the human element, emotion, ambition, morality, was both a resource and a vulnerability. By shaping perception and behavior from youth, They ensured that knights could be relied upon to act effectively even in situations of chaos or moral ambiguity. Even after formal training concluded, the influence of education persisted. Knights, now experienced and battle-tested, carried the lessons of mentorship, symbolism, and moral guidance into campaigns, negotiations, and interactions with allies and rivals. Their decisions, often perceived as spontaneous or inspired by divine guidance, were informed by the principles instilled during formative training. Obedience, loyalty, and judgment became second nature, operating beneath conscious awareness yet aligning with the strategic objectives of the families who had guided them from the earliest stages of preparation. The invisible architecture of influence continued to function, directing human courage toward long-term goals. Beyond the open battlefields and the grand ceremonies of knighthood, there existed a quieter, darker dimension of service, one that required skill, subtlety, and unwavering discretion. These were the secret missions, covert operations, and intricate maneuvers that few chroniclers recorded, yet which played a decisive role in the orchestration of power by the families who guided the knights. Knights, celebrated for courage and valor in public, were often called upon to serve as instruments of influence in the shadows, executing tasks that demanded intelligence, psychological insight, and strategic foresight. The glory of a visible victory was often fleeting. The silent success of a covert operation, however, could shape the fate of kingdoms and orders for decades. Assignments in this hidden world were as varied as they were delicate. Knights might be dispatched to deliver messages of utmost secrecy, sometimes encoded in symbols or hidden within manuscripts, ensuring that information reached its intended recipient without interception. Others were tasked with gathering intelligence, observing rival factions, or monitoring allegiances, their reports forming the basis of strategic decisions that would never be made public. Every mission carried both personal risk and geopolitical significance, and every failure had consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. The knight's bravery was tested not only in open combat but in the moral and psychological demands of secrecy, discretion, and loyalty under pressure. Espionage was a critical element of these operations. Knights traveled disguised as merchants, pilgrims, or diplomats, moving through foreign lands, observing political developments, and establishing networks of informants. Their presence often went unnoticed, their actions interpreted as mundane or ceremonial by those unaware of the deeper purpose. Families who orchestrated these missions understood that knowledge was power, and that subtle observation could yield far greater influence than armies or fortresses alone. Knights became the eyes and ears of a system designed to monitor, manipulate, and control events across territories, their courage and judgment serving as instruments of a larger strategic vision. Covert operations extended to the management of rivalries and potential threats. Knights might infiltrate factions, gain the confidence of adversaries, or subtly redirect alliances in ways that aligned with the patron's objectives. Negotiations, disputes, and even minor conflicts were opportunities to assert influence quietly, guiding outcomes without revealing the architects behind them. Every action required precision, foresight, and an understanding of human behavior. The families directing these missions anticipated how individuals would respond to pressure, persuasion, or deception, ensuring that knights acted in ways that reinforced loyalty, secured advantage, and maintained the balance of power. The psychological demands of these missions were intense. Knights operated in environments where trust was limited, deception common, and the consequences of error severe. Every decision, every interaction, required judgment, courage, and discretion. Families who orchestrated these operations understood the dual nature of human behavior: fear and ambition, loyalty and doubt, courage and vulnerability. By carefully selecting knights for these tasks, training them in observation and subtle influence, and providing guidance without revealing objectives outright, patrons ensured that human agency operated within the desired parameters. The success of these operations relied on the delicate calibration of skill, judgment, and obedience. Moral complexity was a constant companion. Knights might be required to manipulate, deceive, or coerce in the service of objectives that, while strategically necessary, could conflict with personal codes of honor or religious duty. The The families directing these missions anticipated such dilemmas and provided frameworks, symbols, and guidance to help knights navigate the tension between conscience and necessity. Obedience, loyalty, and strategic alignment were reinforced not only through instruction but through the carefully cultivated belief that service to the order and the families guiding it was a higher calling, one in which individual discomfort or moral ambiguity became subordinate to enduring objectives. Logistical and operational coordination was another layer of complexity. Knights assigned to covert tasks relied on communication networks, hidden routes, and the cooperation of allies whose identities and loyalties might also be carefully managed. Families orchestrated the movement of resources, the timing of information delivery, and the placement of agents to maximize the impact of missions while minimizing exposure. Every assignment was a calculated risk, where success required not only skill and courage but also the alignment of multiple variables, including human behavior, geography, and perception. In this environment, even minor errors could have consequences far greater than any battlefield miscalculation. Even the most disciplined knights, trained to endure hardship, fear, and the chaos of battle, were not immune to the subtle, corrosive effects of moral conflict. The secret missions they undertook, guided by families whose ambitions often remained invisible, placed them in positions of profound ethical ambiguity. A knight might be asked to manipulate a rival, deceive an ally, or enforce a decision that ran counter to his own sense of honor or faith. Each choice was fraught with consequence, not only for immediate survival but for the perception of loyalty, the maintenance of alliances, and the broader objectives that extended far beyond any single individual. Courage alone was insufficient. Judgment, discretion, and an understanding of human complexity were equally vital. The weight of these decisions created internal tension. Knights who had grown up believing in the purity of their oaths and the righteousness of their cause suddenly found themselves questioning the alignment of personal virtue with strategic necessity. Could deception serve a higher purpose? Could betrayal be justified if it advanced the order, protected allies, or preserved the vision of the families who guided them? These questions were not theoretical. They were lived realities, pressing on the hearts and minds of men trained to act decisively yet now forced to reconcile duty with conscience. Every mission, every instruction, became a crucible in which loyalty, morality, and human frailty were tested simultaneously. The most common source of inner conflict arose from divided loyalties. Knights were bound to the order, to faith, and to their personal sense of honor, yet their actions were often influenced by the hidden agendas of patrons whose objectives were strategic rather than moral. A knight might follow orders that protected the interests of a distant family, only to find that local allies suffered or that rivals were unjustly punished. The tension between duty and conscience created a psychological landscape in which obedience was necessary but never uncomplicated. Moral ambiguity became a constant companion, shaping thought, decision-making, and emotional resilience. Betrayal, whether real or perceived, intensified this tension. Knights who were forced to deceive comrades, manipulate allies, or act against the apparent interests of the order were often haunted by the knowledge of what they had done. Their courage on the battlefield, once a source of pride, became entangled with shame, doubt, and fear. Yet the families orchestrating these missions understood the necessity of such actions. They cultivated resilience, emphasizing that loyalty to the invisible structure of influence was both strategic and sacred. Knights were subtly guided to reconcile actions with purpose, to internalize the idea that personal conflict was subordinate to the continuity and success of the broader design. The emotional stakes were further compounded by the consequences of failure. A misjudged decision in a covert mission could have immediate and far-reaching effects. Allies alienated, rivals emboldened, or campaigns jeopardized. Knights who failed to navigate these complex moral landscapes often faced scrutiny, retribution, or loss of status. Families who orchestrated these outcomes understood that fear and consequence reinforced loyalty, creating a psychological framework in which obedience and alignment with objectives became habitual. Courage and skill were necessary, but the mastery of ethical complexity ensured that knights could be relied upon to act in ways that served multi-generational strategic goals. Trust, too, became a precarious and vital commodity. Knights were often placed in positions where they could not fully know the intentions of those around them, including their comrades, superiors, or even allies within the order. Every relationship carried potential for manipulation, deception, or betrayal. Families who guided the knights understood that this uncertainty was both a challenge and a tool. By cultivating an environment in which perception, loyalty, and judgment were tested continually, they ensured that knights developed not only martial skill but the psychological and ethical discipline necessary to operate within complex, morally ambiguous situations. Personal ambition added another layer of conflict. Knights often sought recognition, advancement, and honor, yet these desires could clash with the demands of discretion and loyalty to hidden patrons. A victory achieved through personal initiative might contradict strategic instructions. An alliance pursued for prestige might undermine broader objectives. Families who orchestrated these circumstances relied on training, mentorship, and subtle psychological cues to align ambition with long-term strategy, transforming individual desire into a tool of influence. Even personal motivation became part of the orchestration, ensuring that human aspiration served the greater design rather than individual whims. Isolation intensified moral tension. Knights on covert missions often operated far from familiar allies, surrounded by uncertainty and deception.